Hello and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to explore something rather peaceful. The quiet, contemplative life of a monk during what we call the Dark Ages. Now, before we begin, let me pour myself some tea. The period between roughly 500 and 1000 CE was not quite as dark as the name suggests. In fact, within monastery walls, candles flickered late into the night as monks carefully copied manuscripts, tended gardens, and lived according to rhythms that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's walk together through a day in the life of these remarkable individuals who chose a life of prayer, work, and silence. Imagine, if you will, a young man in early medieval Europe. Perhaps he is the third son of a minor noble family, or maybe the child of a merchant. In this world, opportunities are limited. Inheritance goes to the eldest. The church, however, offers something different. It offers purpose, education, and a community. Let's think about what life looked like for someone considering the monastery. The year might be 750, somewhere in what is now France or Germany. You are perhaps 15 years old. Your father has made it clear there's no land for you. Your eldest brother will inherit the estate. Your second brother is being trained for service in the local lord's household, perhaps as a steward or man-at-arms. What options remain? You could try to apprentice with a craftsman, though those positions are competitive and often go to the sons of guild members. You could join the household of a noble as a servant, but the prospects for advancement are limited. Or you could enter the church. The church offers something remarkable for this era: social mobility. A peasant's son, if he's bright and dedicated, can rise to positions of real authority. The church needs educated men, and it's willing to educate those who commit to its service. As a monk, you would learn to read and write, skills that only a tiny fraction of the population possesses. You would study Latin, the language of learning and administration. You would have access to books, those rare and precious objects that contain the accumulated wisdom of centuries. But more than practical considerations, there's something else drawing people to monastic life. A genuine spiritual calling. Perhaps you've always felt slightly apart from the rough-and-tumble world around you. Perhaps you've experienced moments of transcendence during Mass, when the chanting seemed to open up something vast and mysterious. Perhaps you've read or heard about the Desert Fathers, those early Christian hermits who went into the wilderness to pray, and their example speaks to something deep within you. Many monks entered the monastery as oblates, a term that comes from the Latin oblate, meaning one who is offered. These were children given to the church by their families, sometimes as young as 7 years old. Now, to our modern sensibilities, this might seem strange or even cruel, but let's try to understand it in context. In early medieval Europe, child mortality was staggeringly high. Famine was a regular occurrence. War was frequent and brutal. A family with 6 or 7 children might reasonably expect that only 3 or 4 would survive to adulthood. And even those who survived would face lives of hard labor, uncertain food supplies, and vulnerability to violence. The monastery offered something different. A child given to the monastery would be fed reliably. He would sleep indoors, protected from the elements. He would receive medical care when sick, such as it was in that era. He would be educated, learning skills that might otherwise be completely out of reach. In many cases, parents who gave their children to the monastery were making what they saw as the best possible choice for that child's welfare. The ceremony of oblation was solemn and binding. The child would be brought to the monastery, often around age 7, though sometimes younger or older. His parents would present him at the altar, literally offering him to God. The child's hand would be wrapped in the altar cloth, symbolizing his complete dedication to the religious life. A document would be drawn up and signed by the parents, irrevocably committing the child to the monastery. Often the parents would also donate land or money to the monastery, both as a form of dowry for their child and as a way of ensuring the community's goodwill. From that moment, the child belonged to the monastery. He would be raised by the monks, taught the prayers and the rule, educated in reading and writing. He would wear a miniature version of the monastic habit. His entire life would be shaped by this community. But not everyone came to the monastery as a child. Many arrived as adults, and their journeys were often more complex and individual. Consider a merchant who has spent years traveling the trade routes of Europe. He's seen Constantinople, its markets overflowing with silks and spices. He's navigated the dangerous roads through forests where bandits lurked. He's accumulated wealth, but somewhere along the way the wealth stopped meaning as much. Perhaps he had a close brush with death, an illness, or a robbery gone wrong. Perhaps he simply grew weary of the constant striving, the acquisitiveness that drove his days. One evening, he finds himself at a monastery's guest house, and he attends Vespers with the community. The chanting touches something in him, the peace of the place, the sense that these men have found something he's been searching for all his life. Or picture a soldier, a man who has fought in the endless small wars that characterize the period. He's good at what he does, skilled with sword and spear. But he's also seen things that haunt him. Villages burned, children killed. He's done things too, things that wake him in the night. He's in his 30s now, and he's tired. Tired of violence. Tired of the moral compromises that warfare demands. He hears about a monastery known for accepting former soldiers, a place where men like him can seek absolution and peace. Or perhaps a woman, widowed young with no children and no family willing to take her in. She turns to the church for refuge. She might enter a convent, the female equivalent of a monastery, where she would find safety, community, and purpose. Convents followed similar rules to monasteries, and nuns lived lives of prayer and work, much like their male counterparts. The process of becoming a monk was gradual and deliberate. This wasn't something you did on a whim. First came the period as a postulant, the initial stage where you lived at the monastery but had not yet committed. You would participate in some of the community's activities, get a feel for the life. This period might last a few weeks or a few months. If both you and the community felt it was right to proceed, you would become a novice. The novitiate typically lasted a year, sometimes longer. During this time you would learn the rule of your order in detail. Most Western monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a document written around 500 TTE by Benedict of Nursia. This rule, about 73 chapters long, laid out in practical detail how a monastic community should function. As a novice, you would memorize the Psalms, all 150 of them, because they formed the backbone of the divine office, the cycle of prayers that structured each day. You would learn the chants, the particular melodies used for different prayers and different times of the liturgical year. Your voice would become part of the community's voice, blending with the others in harmonies that had been sung in that same church for generations. You would learn the monastery's customs, the unwritten practices that supplemented the rule. Every monastery had its own particular ways of doing things. The exact way to bow during prayers, the proper way to process into the church, the hand signals used during the periods of silence, the schedule of work assignments. All of these things varied from place to place, and you needed to learn your particular monastery's traditions. You would also learn to read and write if you didn't already know how. The monastery needed literate members, men who could copy manuscripts, keep records, read during meals and services. If you came from an educated background, you might help teach those who were less fortunate. If you yourself were illiterate, you would spend hours painstakingly learning your letters, first practicing on wax tablets, then on scraps of parchment too damaged or irregular to use for important work. During your novitiate, you wore a special habit that marked you as not yet fully part of the community. You were in between, no longer of the world but not yet completely of the monastery. This was by design. The novitiate was a testing period for both you and the community. Could you handle the discipline, the early mornings, the long hours of prayer, the manual labor, the silence, the lack of privacy, the simple food, the giving up of your own will in obedience to the abbot? And it wasn't just the community testing you. You were testing them too, testing whether this life was truly your calling. Because you could leave at any point during the novitiate. You could say, "This isn't for me," and return to secular life. No shame in it. Better to discover it now than after taking permanent vows. But if you stayed, if you felt that deep internal certainty that this was your path, you would eventually approach the day of your profession. This was one of the most significant days of your life, comparable to a wedding in its solemnity and permanence. The ceremony would take place during Mass. Before the entire community, you would prostrate yourself before the altar, lying face down on the cold stone floor in a gesture of complete submission and humility. While you lay there, the community would chant the litany of saints, calling on the communion of holy men and women to witness and bless your commitment. Then, you would rise and approach the altar. In your hands you would hold a document you had written out yourself, a profession formula stating your vows. You would read it aloud, and your voice might shake, because this moment was enormous. You would vow stability, committing to remain in this particular community for the rest of your life. You would vow conversion of life, pledging to continuously strive to become more holy, more Christ-like. And you would vow obedience, promising to follow the rule and to submit to the authority of the abbot. These three vows, particularly as articulated in the Benedictine tradition, were carefully chosen. Stability was crucial because early monasticism had sometimes been plagued by wandering monks who would move from monastery to monastery, never settling, never fully committing. Benedict insisted on stability. You chose a community, and you stayed with it through good times and difficult times. Conversion of life encompassed several things: poverty, chastity, and the dedication to spiritual growth. You were promising to give up personal property, to remain celibate, and to continually work on transforming yourself into something holier than you currently were. Obedience was perhaps the most challenging vow for many. It meant surrendering your will to another's judgment. If the abbot assigned you to work in the stables when you wanted to be in the scriptorium, you went to the stables without complaint. If he corrected you for some fault, you accepted the correction with humility. This wasn't about crushing individuality, though it could feel that way. It was about learning to put aside ego, to recognize that your own judgment wasn't always reliable, to trust in a wisdom larger than your own. After reading your profession formula, you would sign it. Then, in a gesture of finality, you would place the document on the altar itself, an offering to God. The community would receive you as a full member, and you would be clothed in the full monastic habit, no longer marked as a novice, but as a professed monk, a full brother. And then you would begin. Your old life would fall away. If you had a family name, you might take a new name, a religious name, symbolizing your rebirth into this new life. The person you were before, with all their attachments and ambitions and personal history, would receive. You would become simply Brother Thomas, or Brother John, or whatever name you had taken. Your identity now was as a member of this community, living this rule, following this path. In the days following your profession, you might feel a sense of profound peace. The decision was made. The rest of your life stretched out before you with clarity. You knew where you would be, what you would be doing. In an uncertain world, this certainty was its own kind of gift. But you might also feel daunted. The rest of your life. Every day rising before dawn for prayer. Every day following the same schedule. Every day in this place, with these people. The magnitude of what you'd committed to might suddenly feel overwhelming. The older monks would recognize this. They'd been through it themselves. They would quietly watch over you, making sure you ate, making sure you slept, ready to offer a word of encouragement if you seemed to be struggling. Because the monastic life, for all its peace and purpose, was demand. The honeymoon period after profession didn't last long. Soon enough, you would encounter the dailiness of it all, the sheer repetitiveness, and you would have to dig deep to find the meaning in the millionth recitation of the same psalm, the thousandth walks to the same church at the same hour. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's step back and think about what happened after profession. In those early days and months when everything was still fresh and you were learning to be a full member of this community that would be your home until death. Let's walk through a monastery now. Picture it in your mind. It's early morning, still dark. We're going to explore this place slowly, carefully, noticing details. The monastery sits in a valley, or perhaps on a low hill. The location was chosen carefully centuries ago when the monastery was founded. The monks needed access to water, so there's a stream or river nearby. They needed land that could be cultivated, so the valley floor spreads out around the monastery buildings, divided into fields. They needed some protection from raiders and bandits, so the site has some natural defensibility, perhaps with the monastery church built in stone thick enough to serve as a refuge in times of danger. As you approach the monastery in the pre-dawn darkness, the first thing you see is the wall. Most monasteries have some kind of enclosure wall, not primarily for military defense, but to mark the boundary between the sacred space within and the secular world without. The wall might be stone, or it might be a wooden palisade. It's not enormously high, perhaps 8 or 10 feet, but it's enough to define the space. There's a gatehouse, and here you'll usually find the porter, the monk whose job it is to welcome guests. The rule of Saint Benedict is very clear that guests should be received as Christ himself, so the porter is carefully chosen, usually an older monk known for his wisdom and kindness. Even at this early hour, if a traveler arrived seeking shelter, the porter would rouse himself to welcome them. But we're not guests. We're going inside, into the heart of the monastery. Pass through the gate, and you enter the outer court. This area is somewhat less strictly regulated than the inner monastery. Here you might find workshops, stables, barns for storing grain, the brewery, the bakery. These buildings buzz with activity during the day. Lay brothers, men who live according to the rule but take simpler vows and focus more on manual labor than on prayer, work here. Servants hired from the local village work here too. The smell of baking bread often permeates this area, mingling with the earthy scent of the stables and the yeasty aroma from the brewery. Continue deeper into the monastery complex, and you come to another gate, more carefully controlled. Beyond this lies the inner monastery, the area reserved primarily for the choir monks, those who have taken full vows and who spend their days in prayer and contemplation as well as work. And here, at the heart of everything, lies the cloister. The cloister is one of the most distinctive features of monastic architecture. It's a square or rectangular courtyard, open to the sky, surrounded on all 4 sides by covered walkways. These walkways have a roof supported by columns or pillars, creating a shaded space where monks can walk, read, or meditate while being sheltered from rain or harsh sun. In the center of the cloister, there's often a garden. It might be quite simple, just grass, and perhaps a few trees. Or it might be more elaborate, with a fountain, or well at its center, and carefully tended plants arranged in geometric beds. Medieval people loved symbolism, and the cloister garden was rich with it. The enclosed garden represented paradise, Eden before the fall. The 4 walkways surrounding it represented the 4 rivers of paradise, or the 4 Gospels. Walking in the cloister, you were constantly reminded of theological truth. The covered walkways of the cloister connect the most important buildings of the monastery, making it possible to move between them without going outside, useful during rain or snow or the heat of summer. Let's walk around the cloister now, slowly, and see what we find. On one side, dominating everything, stands the church. This is always the largest and most impressive building in the monastery. It's built to last, constructed of stone even when other buildings might be wood. The church faces east, toward Jerusalem, toward the rising sun, toward the promise of resurrection and new life. The monastery church is not designed for beauty in the way a great cathedral is. There are no soaring Gothic spires here, no elaborate stained glass. This is an earlier, simpler style. The walls are thick and solid. The windows are small and high, partly for structural reasons and partly to minimize distraction during prayer. The ceiling might be a simple barrel vault, or perhaps a wooden roof supported by heavy beams. Inside, the church is divided into sections. At the eastern end is the sanctuary, where the altar stands. This area is reserved for the priests among the monks. Then comes the choir, where the community gathers for the divine office. The choir stalls are arranged in 2 rows, facing each other, so when the monks chant, they're singing back and forth, one side responding to the other. This antiphonal style of singing is ancient, going back to the Jewish temple tradition and the early Christian communities. The choir stalls themselves are made of wood, often oak, worn smooth by centuries of use. Each monk has his assigned place in the choir, determined by the date of his profession. Those who have been monks longest sit closest to the altar. As a new monk, you would be placed farther back, and over the years, as older monks died, you would gradually move forward. It was a slow physical reminder of the passage of time and the generations of men who had prayed in this same space. If you examine a choir stall closely, you'll notice some interesting features. There's a hinged seat that can flip up, and underneath is a small ledge called a misericord. During long services, when monks were required to stand for extended periods, they could flip up the seat and subtly lean against this ledge, taking some weight off their feet while technically still standing. The word misericord means mercy, a small mercy for tired bodies during hours of prayer. Some monastery churches have crypts beneath the main floor, underground chambers where relics of saints are kept, or where particularly important members of the community are buried. The air down there is cool and still, and the stone walls sweat with moisture. It's a reminder of mortality, of the fact that all the monks who came before have passed into death, and all those currently living will follow. Adjacent to the church, usually on the eastern side, you'll find the sacristy, where vestments and sacred vessels are kept. This room smells of beeswax from the candles and incense stored there. Everything is carefully organized. The vestments for different liturgical seasons, white and gold for feast days, purple for Lent, green for ordinary time, are folded in chests. The chalices and patens, the precious vessels used for the Eucharist, are locked away when not in use. Continuing around the cloister, we come to the chapter house. This building is nearly as important as the church itself. Every morning, after the early prayers, the entire community gathers here. The abbot sits on a raised chair at one end. The monks arrange themselves on benches along the walls. The chapter house gets its name from the practice that begins each meeting. A chapter, a section, from the rule of Saint Benedict is read aloud. The reading rotates through the rule continuously, so over the course of a few months, the entire rule is read. This constant repetition serves to keep the rule fresh in everyone's mind, to remind the community of the principles they've committed to live by. After the chapter is read, the abbot might give a brief commentary or exhortation. Then comes the business of the day. The abbot announces work assignments, discusses any issues that need the community's attention. Perhaps there's a dispute about water rights with a neighboring landowner that needs to be resolved. Perhaps a section of the monastery wall needs repair. Perhaps it's time to discuss what crops to plant in which fields. The chapter meeting is also when faults are confessed publicly and penances assigned. If a monk has broken the rule in some way, he's expected to confess it here. Perhaps he spoke during the time of silence. Perhaps he was late to pray. Perhaps he lost his temper with a younger monk. He would kneel before the community and confess his fault, and the abbot would assign a penance. This might be a period of fasting, or being excluded from the common table, and having to eat alone, or having to prostrate himself before the church door, so all the monks had to step over him as they entered. These penances weren't meant to be cruel. They were meant to be medicinal, to help the monk remember his commitment and to reintegrate him into the community after his failure. The chapter house is usually quite beautiful in its simplicity. The ceiling might be vaulted, creating good acoustics for speaking. There might be narrow windows letting in light. The stone walls are bare, without decoration, because decoration would be a distraction. This is a place for serious business, for the community to govern itself, to hold itself accountable. Continue around the cloister, and you come to the refectory, the dining hall. This is a long, narrow room, with tables arranged in rows. The monks eat in silence, or rather they eat while listening to readings from scripture, or from the lives of saints. There's a pulpit built into one wall, raised up, so the reader can see over the heads of the diners, and project his voice to fill the space. The tables are simple, heavy planks of wood supported on trestles. There are benches rather than chairs. Each monk's place is set with basic utensils: a wooden bowl, a spoon, perhaps a small knife. There are no forks. Forks won't become common in Europe for many centuries yet. The abbot has his own table at the far end of the refectory, slightly elevated. He eats the same food as everyone else in the same portions, but his position gives him a view of the whole room, allowing him to observe the community during meals. The meals themselves are simple. The main meal of the day typically consists of bread, a thick soup or stew made with vegetables and legumes, perhaps some cheese, and watered wine or ale to drink. Meat is rarely served, only for the sick or elderly, and even then, it's usually poultry rather than red meat. Fish is allowed on certain days, and it's usually preserved fish, salted or dried rather than fresh. Fresh fish is a luxury, only available if the monastery has fish ponds or access to a river or coast. The food is plain but adequate. The cooks in the monastery kitchen work to make it palatable, using herbs from the garden to add flavor. Onions and leeks are common. Garlic is used. Salt, precious salt, is added to make the food more appetizing and to help preserve it. During the meal, everyone eats in a particular way. You don't talk. You don't make unnecessary noise. You eat slowly, mindfully, remembering that this food is a gift from God, that it comes from the labor of your brothers and from the earth itself. There's a spiritual dimension to everything in the monastery, even eating. If you need something during the meal, you use sign language. Point to the bread if you want bread passed to you. Touch your fingers together if you want more wine. These gestures are standardized, and every monk knows them. After the meal, the reader descends from the pulpit, and the abbot offers a prayer of thanksgiving. Then the community processes out, usually going directly to the church for the next office of prayer. The kitchen adjoins the refectory, and it's one of the hardest working spaces in the monastery. The cooks rise early to start preparing the day's meals. There's a large hearth for cooking, with iron pots hanging over the fire. There's a long table for preparing food, for chopping vegetables and kneading bread dough. The kitchen is hot, especially in summer, and the cooks often work with sweat pouring down their faces. Kitchen duty rotates among the monks. It's seen as an important service, and even the abbot might take a turn in the kitchen. The rule of Benedict emphasizes that all work is valuable, that there's no task too humble for any monk. Washing dishes, sweeping floors, cooking meals, these are all opportunities for service, for humility, for growing in holiness. From the kitchen, a covered passage often leads to the warming room. This is one of the few spaces in the monastery that's heated during winter. Other than the kitchen itself, the monks gather here during the coldest months to warm themselves, especially after coming in from outdoor work with hands and feet numb from cold. There's a fireplace, and the room has a comfortable, almost cozy feeling that's rare in the monastery. Adjacent to the warming room, you might find the day room, a common area where monks can engage in certain types of work that don't require silence. Mending clothes, for example, or preparing materials for the scriptorium. Now let's climb the stairs, usually located in one corner of the cloister, up to the dormitory on the second floor. The dormitory is a long, open hall with rows of beds on either side. Each monk has a simple bed, a wooden frame with rope supports and a straw-filled mattress on top. There's a wool blanket, and perhaps a small pillow. That's all. There's no privacy in the dormitory. No walls, no curtains. You sleep in a room with dozens of other men, and you can hear them breathing, snoring, shifting in their sleep. For someone used to having their own space, this can be one of the most challenging aspects of monastic life. You're never alone. Well, almost never. Some monasteries have individual cells for the monks, tiny private rooms, but these are more common in later periods or in contemplative orders. In a typical Benedictine monastery during our period, the communal dormitory is the norm. Next to each bed is a small chest or basket where the monk keeps his few possessions, a change of clothes, perhaps a small prayer book, if he's wealthy enough or important enough to have one, a comb, maybe a knife. The rule specifies that monks shouldn't have personal property, but in practice they were allowed these few basic items. The dormitory connects directly to the church by a stairway, the night stair. This allows the monks to go directly from their beds to the choir for the night office without having to go outside, which is particularly important during winter. The dormitory is cold. Medieval people didn't heat sleeping areas, believing that fresh air, even cold air, was healthier than warm, stuffy air. So, in winter you sleep in your woolen habit, wrapped in your blanket, and you wake in the pre-dawn darkness with frost, sometimes visible on the inside of the windows. Down another stairway, usually at the opposite end of the dormitory from the night stairs, you reach the latrine. Medieval monasteries were surprisingly advanced in their sanitary arrangements. The latrine is typically a long room with a bench running along one side. The bench has holes cut in it at intervals. Beneath the bench, there's either a cesspit that needs to be emptied periodically, or in the best designed monasteries, a channel of running water diverted from a stream that carries waste away. The Romans knew how to build such things, and the knowledge was preserved in some places. The latrine is located as far from the living and eating areas as practical, often positioned so that the prevailing winds carry any odors away from the main monastery buildings. Still, it smells bad. There's no getting around that. But it's a necessary part of life, and the monks use it matter-of-factly, without complaint. Back to the cloister level, there's one more building we need to explore, the infirmary. Every monastery has an infirmary, a place where sick or elderly monks are cared for. This is a separate building, usually on the quieter side of the monastery, away from the bustle of the workshops and kitchen. The infirmary has its own chapel, because sick monks often can't make it to the main church for prayers. It has a hall with beds for the patients. There's a warming fire here even in mild weather, because the sick need warmth. There's a small kitchen where special foods can be prepared. Broths and soft foods that are easier for the sick to eat. The infirmarian, the monk in charge of the infirmary, is chosen carefully. He needs medical knowledge, such as it is in this era. He needs patience and gentleness. Caring for the sick is seen as one of the highest forms of Christian service, and the infirmarian's role is respected. The infirmary is where you go when you have a fever, or when you're injured in an accident, or when you're simply old and can no longer keep up with the demands of the full monastic tassicle. Here you're excused from attending all the hours of prayer. You can sleep when you need to. You can eat meat, which is forbidden to the healthy monks, but allowed as medicine for the sick. Many monks spend their final days in the infirmary, and many die there. Death is not hidden away in the monastery. It's acknowledged as a natural part of life. The completion of the journey each monk began when he took his vows. When a monk is dying, his brothers gather around his bed. They pray the prayers for the dying. They hold vigil, and when he passes, they wash his body, wrap it in a simple shroud, and carry it to the church, where it will lie before the altar, while the community prays for his soul. Then he'll be buried in the monastery cemetery, usually with a simple stone marker bearing his name and the date of his death. The cemetery is often located on the north side of the church, in an area that gets less sun. Medieval symbolism associated the north with death and darkness. The graves are arranged in rows, and the cemetery is kept neat, the grass cut, weeds pulled. Over time, as generations pass, the cemetery fills. Some monasteries have been continuously occupied for so many centuries that their cemeteries contain hundreds or even thousands of graves, layer upon layer of monks who lived and prayed and died in the same place. Walking through the monastery cemetery in the evening light, reading the names on the old stones, half worn away by weather and time, you can't help but feel the weight of history. Brother Aldrich died 7034. Brother Fortunatus died 7056. Brother Wilfred died 7. Each one was a person with hopes and fears, with doubts and faith, with a full interior life that we can only imagine now. And each one was part of this ongoing community, this living tradition that stretches back centuries and will, God willing, continue for centuries more. There are other buildings too, depending on the size and wealth of the monastery. There might be a separate building for the scriptorium, the writing room, though in many monasteries the scriptorium is simply a space in the cloister walkway or in the warming room. There might be a guest house, a substantial building where important visitors can be lodged in comfort. There might be a novitiate building, separate quarters for those who are still in their year of testing. The gardens are extensive. There's the kitchen garden, with vegetables for the table. There's the herb garden, with medicinal plants and aromatic herbs for cooking and for making the monastery more pleasant smelling. There's the orchard, with apple trees, pear trees, perhaps plums or cherries. There might be a vineyard if the climate is suitable, for making wine. There are fish ponds, carefully maintained to provide fresh fish for fast days. There are fields stretching out beyond the immediate monastery buildings, where grain is grown and where sheep or cattle graze. All of this, the buildings and gardens and fields, make up a complete world, a self-sufficient community that can provide for its own needs. The monastery is like a small town, with specialized workers and diverse activities, all oriented toward a single purpose: the worship of God and the salvation of souls. As the sky begins to lighten, the monastery starts to wake. In the dormitory, monks stir, rising from their beds. The bell rings, calling them to prayer. Another day begins, much like the day before, much like the day that will follow. And in this repetition, this daily cycle that mirrors the great cycles of the liturgical year, there's a deep peace, a sense of rightness and order in a world that often seems chaotic and frightening. This is home. These buildings, these walls, these gardens, this community. For a monk, there's nowhere else he would rather be. Time moves differently in a monastery. The day is divided not by clocks, but by prayer, not by hours numbered 1 through 12, though that system exists, but by offices, by appointed times when the community gathers to sing the psalms and offer their worship to God. Let me describe this rhythm for you, slowly, so you can feel it. Close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine yourself living within this pattern, day after day, year after year. It begins with vigils, also called matin. This is the night office, taking place in the deepest part of the night. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, though the exact time varies with the season. In summer, when nights are short, vigils might be at 2. In winter, when darkness stretches long, it might be closer to 3, giving the monks a bit more sleep. The bell rings in the darkness. If you've never heard a monastery bell at night, it's difficult to describe the quality of that sound. It's not harsh or jarring. It's deep and resonant, and it seems to roll across the darkness like a wave. The bell ringer, usually a younger monk assigned this responsibility, pulls the rope in a steady rhythm. The sound carries through the dormitory, and one by one, the monks wake. You wake from deep sleep, from dreams. For a moment, you might not remember where you are. Then awareness returns. You're in your bed in the dormitory. The bell is ringing. It's time for vigils. You rise in the darkness. Around you, other monks are rising too. You can hear them. The rustle of fabric, the creak of bed frames, the soft shuffle of feet on stone floors. No one speaks. This is the great silence, which lasts from Compline the previous evening until after morning mass. Speech is forbidden, except in cases of real necessity. You're already dressed, more or less. Monks sleep in their habits, or at least in most of their clothes. You just need to put on your shoes, rough leather shoes or perhaps wooden clogs, and perhaps splash some cold water on your face from the basin near the dormitory entrance. The water is shockingly cold, especially in winter, but it helps wake you up. Then you join the procession down the night stairs, directly from the dormitory into the church. The stairs are worn smooth in the middle from centuries of monks making this same journey in the dark. You have to be careful not to trip. You know these stairs well by now. You could probably navigate them with your eyes closed, but still in the darkness, you place your feet carefully. The church is dark too, lit only by a few candles on the altar, and perhaps some oil lamps hanging from the walls. The light is dim, barely enough to see by, and it creates deep shadows in the corners of the building. The air is cold. Your breath mists in front of you. You move to your place in the choir stalls. Everyone has an assigned place based on seniority. You know exactly where to stand, which stall is yours. The familiarity of it is comforting in the darkness and cold. The abbot or the cantor gives a signal, and the office begins. Domini, labia mea, apoparis, the opening versicle. O Lord, open my lips. And the response, et os meum annuntiabit laudem tuam, and my mouth shall proclaim your praise. Then the singing begins, the psalms, chanted in Latin, in those ancient melodies that have been passed down through the generations. The chant style is called plain song or Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory the Great, though its origins are older and more complex than that. It's monophonic, a single melodic line without harmony, and it has a quality that's both austere and beautiful. The psalms are sung antiphonally, one side of the choir singing a verse, the other side responding with the next verse, back and forth. Your voice blends with the voices of your brothers, and the sound fills the church, echoing off stone walls. It's dark, you're tired, you're cold, but there's something about this singing that transcends all of that. It's ancient, this practice. Christians have been singing these psalms since the very beginning, and Jews were singing them centuries before that. You're part of something that stretches back thousands of years. Vigils is the longest office of the day. It can last an hour, sometimes longer. There are 12 psalms, sometimes more on feast days. There are readings from Scripture, readings from the Church Fathers. There's time for silent meditation between the sections. Your mind might wander. It's hard not to. In the darkness and tiredness, you might think about the work you need to do later in the day. You might worry about something, some tasks you failed at, some correction the abbot gave you. You might simply struggle to stay awake, fighting off the drowsiness that threatens to overtake you. But then a phrase from the Psalms catches your attention. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. and suddenly you're present again, aware. And the words mean something. They're not just words you're reciting by rote. They're a prayer, your prayer, expressing something you feel but couldn't articulate on your own. This is one of the paradoxes of the liturgical life. Much of it is repetition. The same psalm sung over and over, year after year. And yet, because you're different each time, because your circumstances and your inner state change, the psalms can speak to you in new ways. A psalm you've sung 1,000 times can suddenly hit differently, can suddenly express exactly what you're feeling, can suddenly comfort you or challenge you in a way it never has before. Vigils concludes with prayers, with the singing of the Tatum on feast days, with a blessing. Then there's a period of quiet. Some monks return to the dormitory to sleep for another hour or two. Others stay in the church for private prayer. Still others might go to the warming room or begin early morning work. If you're a younger, healthier monk, you probably return to bed. The older monks, the ones who sleep less soundly, often stay up. They use this time for lectio divina, sacred reading, or for personal prayer. The church remains dimly lit, and you can see their figures, still and quiet in the choir stalls, or kneeling before side altars. The sky begins to lighten. Dawn comes slowly in winter, quickly in summer, and as the first light appears, the bell rings again. It's time for lauds. Lauds means praises, and this office welcomes the new day. You rise from your bed again, if you went back to sleep, or you gather in the church again, if you stayed awake. The monastic day is formally beginning. Lauds have a different character from vigils. There's more energy to it, more move. The psalms are psalms of praise, thanking God for the gift of a new day, for life, for creation. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Even if you're still tired, even if you'd rather be in bed, there's something about lauds that lifts the spirit. The light grows stronger as lauds progresses. By the end of the office, you can see clearly. The church, which seems so mysterious and shadowy during vigils, is now just the familiar space where you spend so much of your time. After lauds comes prime, at what the Romans called the first hour, around 6 in the morning. Prime is shorter than vigils or lauds. It consists of a hymn, some psalms, a short reading, and prayers. Prime includes the blessing of the day's work. The various work assignments might be mentioned. There's a sense of transition, of moving from the purely contemplative to the active. After prime, the community processes to the chapter house for the daily chapter meeting we discussed earlier. Then, after the chapter meeting, the monks disperse to their various work assignments. But not for long, because soon it will be time for Tethys. Tethys is the office of the third hour, around 9 in the morning. By now the morning's work is well underway. You might be in the scriptorium, copying a manuscript. You might be in the garden, hoeing weeds. You might be in the workshop, making repairs to tools. Whatever you're doing, when the bell rings for Tethys, you stop and make your way to the church. This is one of the interesting things about the monastic schedule. Work is constantly interrupted for prayer. You can't get into a deep flow state with your work because you know that in an hour or two, you'll need to stop for the next office. Some people might find this frustrating, but it serves a purpose. It ensures that prayer remains central, that work doesn't become all-consuming. It creates a rhythm of action and contemplation, of doing and being. Tethys is brief, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes. A hymn, 3 psalms, a short reading, prayers, then back to work. At the 6th hour, noon, the bell rings for sext. Again, you stop your work and go to the church. Sext has a particular association with midday, with the heat of the sun at its zenith. The hymn often refers to this, asking for God's protection during the bright hours of the day. After sext comes dinner, the main meal of the day. We discussed the refectory earlier, the silent meal, with readings, The meal lasts perhaps half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. The food is simple but adequate. You eat mindfully, listening to the reader, conscious that this too is part of the monastic life, that even eating can be an act of worship if done with the right intention. After dinner, there might be a brief period of rest, especially in summer when the heat of the day makes vigorous work difficult. Some monks take a short nap, a siesta. Others might engage in quiet activities like mending clothes or reading. Then it's back to work until the bell rings for none, the office of the ninth hour, around 3 in the afternoon. None follows the same pattern as Tertian and Sext. Hymn, psalms, reading, prayers. Back to work. The afternoon work period is often the longest uninterrupted stretch of the day. From after none until vespers, you might have 3 hours or more to devote to your tasks. If you're a scribe working on a manuscript, this is when you can really make progress. If you're working in the fields, this is when you can accomplish significant labor. But then, as the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, as the light starts to take on that golden quality of late afternoon, the bell rings for vespers. Vespers. Many monks consider this the most beautiful office of the day. Vespers means evening, and this office marks the transition from day to night, from labor to rest. There's a particular peace to vespers, a sense of completion. The church fills with that slanting golden light that seems to make everything more beautiful. The psalms of vespers are psalms of trust and peace. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. The magnificent merry song of praise is sung during vespers. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. Vespers lasts longer than the little hours of tertia, sex, and none, but not as long as vigils or lauds. Perhaps half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. When it concludes, there's a sense of the day's formal work being done. After vespers, there's supper, a lighter meal than dinner, perhaps just bread and cheese and ale, with some fruit if it's in season. Then there's a period of free time, though free is perhaps not quite the right word. You might return to your work if there's something urgent that needs finishing. You might spend time in private reading or prayer. You might simply sit in the cloister, watching the last light fade from the sky, resting your body after a day of labor. Some monasteries have a recreation period after vespers, when monks are permitted to talk with each other, to relax a bit. This is a relatively late development, though, and in the earlier, stricter period we're focusing on, silence would be maintained. As darkness falls, the bell rings one final time for the day. It's time for compline, the completion of the daily cycle. Compline is the shortest office, perhaps only 10 or 15 minutes. It's intimate, almost tender. The psalms are psalms of trust and protection. Into your hands I commend my spirit. He who dwells in the shelter of the highest will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. There's a sense of putting the day to rest, of letting go of worries, of placing yourself in God's hands for the night. After the psalms and prayers, there's one final ritual. The community sings the Psalm Legina, or another Marian anthem, a hymn to the Virgin Mary asking for her protection through the night. Then the abbot blesses the community with holy water, sprinkling it over the assembled monks. And then, silence. The great silence begins. From now until after morning mass the next day, speech is forbidden, except in emergencies. The monks file out of the church in complete quiet. They walk through the dark cloister to the dormitory. They remove their shoes and lie down in their beds. The day is over. But of course, in a few hours, the bell will ring again for vigils, and the cycle will begin anew. This pattern, this daily rhythm of prayer, is called the Divine Office, or the Liturgy of the Hours. It's based on the Psalms, and on the early Christian practice of praying at set times throughout the day and night. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Pray without ceasing." and monastic hours are an attempt to fulfill that command, to structure the entire day around prayer. The number and timing of the offices evolved over the centuries. The rule of Saint Benedict established 8 offices: vigils, or matins, lauds, prime, tertii, sex, nun, vespers, and compline. Other monastic rules had different numbers, but by the early medieval period, most Western monasteries followed Benedict's scheme. The content of each office consists primarily of psalms. Over the course of a week, the entire Psalter, all 150 psalms, is sung. Some psalms appear more frequently than others. Psalm 95, "Come, let us sing to the Lord," begins vigils every day. Psalm 51, the great penitential psalm, "Have mercy on me, O God," is a regular part of lauds. Certain psalms are associated with particular times of day because their content fits the hour. In addition to the psalms, each office includes hymns, passages from scripture, and prayers. The hymns are often ancient, dating back to the early church. Many are attributed to Saint Ambrose of Milan from the 4th century. The melodies are simple, but memorable, and they vary according to the season and feast. The scripture readings at vigils are more substantial. During this long night office, the monks listen to extended passages from the Bible or from the writings of the Church Fathers. Someone reads aloud, and the others listen. The reader stands at a lectern, and he reads slowly, clearly, so everyone can follow. The acoustics of the church are usually good, designed to carry the human voice, so even in a large space, the reader can be heard. The liturgical calendar adds complexity and variation to this daily pattern. The church year is divided into seasons: Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and ordinary time. Each season has its own character, its own selections of psalms and readings, its own hymns. During Advent, the weeks before Christmas, there's a sense of anticipation and longing. The hymns speak of waiting for the Messiah. The readings are from the Old Testament prophets foretelling Christ's coming. Christmas brings joy and celebration. The offices during the 12 days of Christmas are filled with beautiful hymns and readings about the Incarnation, God becoming human in the person of Jesus. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, is solemn. The monks fast more strictly during Lent. The single daily meal is taken in the evening rather than at midday. The readings focus on repentance, on Christ's passion and death. The mood in the church is subdued. Then comes Holy Week, the most intense week of the liturgical year. On Maundy Thursday, there's the washing of feet, reenacting Christ's washing his disciples' feet at the Last Supper. On Good Friday, the monks venerate the cross, approaching one by one to kiss the wood. On Holy Saturday, there's a vigil, waiting in darkness for the resurrection. And then Easter, the greatest feast of the year. The joy is almost explosive after the somber weeks of Lent. Alleluia is sung repeatedly, a word that was omitted entirely during Lent. The Easter season lasts 50 days until Pentecost, and throughout this period, the offices are celebratory, focusing on the resurrection and its meaning. Beyond the seasons, there are individual feast days, days dedicated to particular saints or events in the life of Christ or Mary. Every monastery has a special feast for its patron saint. If you're in a monastery dedicated to Saint Benedict, his feast day on March 21st is a major celebration. The offices on feast days have special prayers and readings specific to the saint being honored. The effect of all this, the daily cycle of offices combined with the turning of the liturgical year, is that time takes on a sacred quality. You're not just living through a series of identical days. Each day is different, located at a specific point in the great cycles of daily prayer and yearly celebration. Today might be Tuesday in the second week of Lent. Tomorrow will be Wednesday in the second week of Lent. You know where you are in time, not by dates and numbers, but by this liturgical framework. The bells that call the monks to prayer are absolutely central to this system. Without the bells, the whole thing would fall apart. Someone has to know what time it is, has to be watching the stars, or a water clock, or a candle marked with hours, and has to ring the bell at the right times. The bell ringer has an important job. He's responsible for waking the community, for calling them to prayer, for structuring the day. If he oversleeps, if he rings the bell too early or too late, it disrupts everything. So the bell ringer is chosen carefully, usually someone reliable and conscientious. The monastery bell has a particular sound. As I mentioned, it's usually cast bronze, and its tone depends on its size and shape. A monastery might have multiple bells, different ones used for different purposes. A large bell for calling to major offices, a smaller bell for other signals. The bells are blessed when they're first installed, dedicated to God's service just like the monks themselves. Hearing the bells becomes so much a part of your life as a monk that you internalize the rhythm. Even when you're working at some distance from the monastery buildings out in the fields or forest, you can hear the bells, and they orient you in time. You know without consciously thinking about it that it's approaching sexter, or that vespers will be soon. At night, during the great silence, the bells are softer, gentler. The bell for vigils is rung slowly, quietly, so as not to startle people awake too harshly. There's a kindness in this, a recognition that waking in the middle of the night is difficult, and the transition should be eased as much as possible. The practice of psalmody, the singing of psalms, is at the heart of the divine office. The Psalms are the prayer book of the Bible. 150 poems of praise, lament, thanksgiving, and petition. They were composed over centuries by various authors and were used in Jewish temple worship. Jesus himself would have prayed the psalm. The early Christians adopted them, and they've been central to Christian prayer ever since. The Psalms express the full range of human emotion. There are psalms of pure joy. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. There are psalms of despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? There are psalms of anger. Oh God, break the teeth in their mouths. There are psalms of trust. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. By praying the psalms daily, monks internalize them. The psalms become the language of their own prayer. When a monk is happy, a psalm of praise comes to mind. When he's struggling, a psalm of lament articulates what he's feeling. The psalms give him words for his relationship with God. Some monks memorize all 150 psalms. This is a significant accomplishment, representing hundreds of hours of study and practice. But even for those who don't fully memorize them, the constant repetition means that large portions of the psalter become familiar, that certain verses and phrases are always at hand in memory. The way the psalms are sung is important too. Gregorian chant, the style used in Western monasteries, has a meditative quality. It's not fast or rhythmically complex. It flows, rises and falls, follows the natural rhythm of the Latin text. Singing in this style requires concentration. You have to pay attention to the cantor, stay with the other singers, breathe at the right moments. But when it's done well, when the community is unified in their singing, the effect is transcendent. The individual voices blend into one voice, and that one voice seems to fill not just the church, but the space between earth and heaven. You're aware that you're singing, that your voice is part of this, but you're also carried along by something larger than yourself. This is one of the central experiences of monastic life, this sense of being part of something greater. You're not just an individual monk doing your own spiritual practice. You're part of a community, and the community's prayer is more than the sum of its parts. When you're too tired or distracted to pray well on your own, the community carries you. Your brother's faith supports your faith. Their voices lift yours. And this community extends beyond the monks physically present. You're praying in communion with all the monks in all the monasteries throughout the Christian world. all following roughly the same schedule, all singing the same psalms. You're praying with the monks who came before you, who prayed in this same church, and with the monks who will come after you. You're praying with the angels and saints in heaven, joining your voice to the eternal song of praise. This is how monks think about the divine office. It's not just a duty or a task to be completed. It's participation in something cosmic, something that connects earth to heaven, time to eternity. Of course, the reality is often more mundane. You're tired. Your knees hurt from kneeling. The monk next to you is singing slightly off-key, and it's distracting. You're thinking about the manuscript you're copying and whether you'll finish it before the ink runs out. You're human, and your mind wanders. But even in the midst of distraction, even when you're just going through the motions, the practice itself is valuable. The rule of Saint Benedict talks about this. He says that monks should sing the psalms in such a way that our minds are in harmony with our voices. But he also recognizes that this is an ideal, that often our minds are not in harmony, that we struggle with attention and devotion. The solution is not to give up, but to persist, to keep showing up, keep singing the psalms, keep following the rhythm of the hours. Over time, over years and decades, this practice shapes you. It creates grooves in your soul. The psalms sink deep into your consciousness. The rhythm of prayer becomes your natural rhythm. Older monks, men who have lived this life for 40 or 50 years, often have a quality of peace about them that's hard to describe. They've sung the same psalms 10,000 times, 20,000 times. They know vigils will come in the middle of the night, as it always has. They know vespers will arrive as the sun sets, as it always does. This certainty, this reliability becomes a kind of anchor. The world outside might be chaotic, but within the monastery, the hours keep their steady rhythm, and there's profound comfort in that. There's also the sense that you're keeping vigil for the world. The world sleeps, but monks are awake in the night, praying. The world is busy with its concerns, but monks regularly stop their work to pray. You're holding space for prayer in a world that often forgets to pray. This is part of a monk's vocation. You've withdrawn from the world not to escape it, but to serve it in a particular way. Your prayer is not just for yourself. It's for everyone. For the peasants in the villages, for the nobles in their castles, for travelers on the roads, for people facing death, or sickness, or despair, for people who don't believe in God, or who have forgotten Him. You're praying for all of them, standing in the gap, offering to God the worship and praise that they're not offering. So, when the bell rings in the middle of the night, and you rise from your warm bed into the cold darkness, there's a purpose to it beyond just following a rule. You're answering a call. You're taking up your post. You're joining your voice to the eternal song. And in doing so, you're fulfilling the promise you made when you took your vows, the promise to seek God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. The hours turn. The days pass. The seasons change. And through it all, the rhythm continues, steady and sure, like a heartbeat, like the tide, like the movement of the stars across the night sky. This is the life you've chosen, and this is how you live it. 1 hour at a time, one psalm at a time, one day at a time, faithful to the end. Now, let's spend some time in the scriptorium, because this is where monks did some of their most important work. This is where the past was preserved, where knowledge was copied and transmitted, where beauty was created on parchment pages that would last for centuries. The scriptorium might be a dedicated room, perhaps on an upper floor, where the light is best. Or it might simply be a section of the cloister walkway, the covered arcade around the courtyard, where desks have been set up to catch the natural light. Some monasteries have their scriptorium in the warming room during winter, the one heated space where monks can work without their fingers going completely numb from cold. Wherever it's located, the scriptorium is quiet. This is serious work, requiring concentration, and unnecessary noise is forbidden. Monks working here communicate through sign language when they need something. A gesture for more ink, a sign for a different pen. A motion indicating you need to consult a reference book. Let me describe what it's like to work here, slowly, so you can picture it clearly. You arrive at your desk in the morning. After tercer perhaps, when the light is good but not yet too bright. Your desk is positioned carefully to make the most of natural light. In an ideal situation, you're facing north, because northern light is steady and doesn't change as much throughout the day as light from other directions. Direct sunlight is actually problematic because it creates glare and shadows that shift as the sun moves. Your desk is a slanted writing surface, angled to make it easier to see your work and to prevent your back from cramping as you lean over. The angle is about 30 degrees or so. The desk might have a small drawer or shelf underneath where you keep your tools and materials. On the desk before you are your current project. Let's say you're copying a gospel book, the 4 Gospels bound together. This is one of the most common types of books produced in monasteries, because every church needs a gospel book for reading during Mass. And churches are being founded all the time as Christianity spreads and grows. The exemplar, the book you're copying from, is positioned on a separate stand next to your desk. This exemplar might be quite old, perhaps copied a century ago from an even older exemplar. You can see where previous scribes made corrections, where they scratched out errors and wrote in the correct words. The parchment is stained with age, the ink faded to brown. You handle it carefully. Reverend, this book has traveled far to reach you, and it will travel on after you're done with it, passed to another monastery that needs it. The parchment you're writing on is fresh, prepared recently in the monastery's own parchment workshop, or perhaps purchased from a specialist in the nearest town. Do you know how parchment is made? It's quite a process, and worth understanding, because it helps you appreciate the material you're working with. Parchment begins with animal skin, usually from sheep, goats, or cat. The very finest parchment, called vellum, comes from calf skin, especially from young calves or even stillborn calves. The skin is thin, smooth, almost translucent. It's expensive for everyday work. For books that don't need to be particularly fancy, sheepskin is used. It's coarser, thicker, but still perfectly serviceable. The skins are first soaked in water to clean them and make them pliable. Then they're treated with lime, which helps remove the hair. After several days in the lime solution, the skins are stretched on wooden frames, pulled taut, and scraped with curved knives to remove any remaining hair and flesh. The scraping has to be done carefully. Too much pressure and you'll tear the skin. Too little and you'll leave rough patches that won't take ink well. Once scraped, the skin is treated with pumice stone to smooth the surface further. Then it's left to dry while still stretched on the frame. The tension of the stretching, combined with the drying, transforms the skin into something different from leather. It becomes parchment, stiff and pale and receptive to ink. A single sheet provides enough parchment for perhaps 4 to 8 leaves, depending on the size of the book being made. A large Bible might require the skins of 300 sheep. This is why books are so valuable, so precious. The raw materials alone represent significant cost and labor. The parchment you're working with today has been carefully prepared. It's been cut to size and ruled with lines to guide your writing. The ruling is done with a metal stylus, or sometimes with a lead point, pressing into the parchment hard enough to leave a visible groove, but not hard enough to damage the surface. The lines are evenly spaced, perhaps a half-inch apart, creating a grid for your text. Before you begin writing, you need to prepare your tools. Your primary tool is your quill pen. You've made this pen yourself from a goose feather, and you'll need to remake it, or at least resharpen it, several times throughout the day. Making a good quill pen is a skill. You start with a large flight feather from the wing of a goose. The feathers from the left wing are slightly curved in a way that's more comfortable for a right-handed scribe. so those are preferred. You strip away most of the barbs, the soft feathery part, leaving just a few at the very top if you want, or removing them entirely. The barrel of the feather, the hollow shaft, is what you'll work with. First, you harden the barrel by heating it. You might thrust it into hot sand, or hold it near a flame, being careful not to burn it. The heat makes the material harder and less likely to split when you cut it. Then comes the cutting. You use a very sharp knife, your pen knife, and you make a careful cut at an angle to create the nib. Then you make a slit up the center of the nib, which helps the ink flow more smoothly. Finally, you make a straight cut across the tip to create the writing edge. The angle and width of this final cut determine the character of your writing. A broad nib creates thick, bold letters. A narrow nib creates fine, delicate lines. You adjust it based on what kind of script you're writing and how large you want the letters to be. You'll need to recut the nib multiple times throughout the day as it wears down and loses its edge. The pen knife is always at hand, and you develop a rhythm of writing, resharpening. Your ink sits in an inkhorn, a small container made from an actual cow's horn, sealed at the wide end, with a small opening at the top. The ink is thick and black, made from oak galls. These are the strange round growths you find on oak trees, formed when a wasp lays its eggs in the tree's tissue. The galls are harvested, dried, and ground into powder. This powder is mixed with iron salts and gum arabic, a resin from acacia trees that helps the ink bind to the parchment. Add water, and you have ink. The ink is precious. It's labor-intensive to make, and the ingredients aren't always easy to obtain. You're careful not to waste it. When you dip your quill, you don't overload it. You take just enough to write several words, then dip again. You might also have red ink, made from vermilion or red lead. Red ink is used for titles, for important words, for the beginning letters of new sections. The alternation of black and red text is not just decorative, it serves a practical purpose, helping readers navigate the page and find important passages quickly. If you're working on an illuminated manuscript, a really special book, you'll have access to other colors as well. Blue made from lapis lazuli, an expensive stone imported from Afghanistan, ground into powder and mixed with binding agents. Gold, either in powder form mixed into paint, or as thin sheets of gold leaf that can be applied to the parchment. Green, made from verdigris, copper corrosion. Yellow, from orpiment, a mineral containing arsenic that's quite toxic and requires careful handling. But let's say today, you're working on a standard text, not an elaborate illuminated manuscript. You're using just black ink, and your job is to copy the text accurately and legibly. You begin. You dip your quill, position it at the proper angle against the parchment, and start to write. The script you're using is probably Caroline minuscule, a clear, readable script that was standardized during the reign of Charlemagne and that has become the standard for Latin texts throughout much of Europe. Caroline minuscule is beautiful in its simplicity. The letters are well proportioned, with consistent height and spacing. There are clear distinctions between different letters, so min and u don't get confused, something that was a problem in earlier scripts. The script has both majuscule, uppercase letters, and minuscule, lowercase letters, used in appropriate places. Your hand moves across the page, left to right, forming one letter after another. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word, the opening of the Gospel of John. Words you've copied before, words you'll copy again. You have to concentrate. One lapse in attention and you might skip a word, or duplicate a word, or misspell something. The consequences of error are significant. If you make a mistake and don't catch it, that error will be copied by whoever next copies from your manuscript, and the error will propagate forward through time. You're responsible for accuracy, for fidelity to the text. Of course, errors do happen. You're human. Your attention wanders. Your eye skips from one line to another in the exemplar, and you leave out a sentence. You transpose two letters, writing receive instead of receive. You nod off for a moment, exhausted from rising at 2 in the morning for vigils, and your pen drags across the page, leaving an ugly ink smear. When you catch an error, you correct it. For a small mistake, you can scrape away the incorrect letters with your penknife, gently abrading the surface of the parchment. Then write the correct letters in their place. For a bigger mistake, you might need to indicate more clearly what you've done, drawing lines through the incorrect text, and writing the correct version above the line or in the margin. Some mistakes aren't caught until later. Maybe not until after you've finished the whole book. Then someone else, a corrector, will go through your work, comparing it to the exemplar, checking for errors. The corrector marks mistakes and makes corrections in a different colored ink, so it's clear what's original and what's been changed. In the margins of many medieval manuscripts, you can find notes written by scribes. Sometimes these are serious annotations, explanations of difficult words, or references to other texts. But sometimes they're more personal. "This parchment is hairy," complains one scribe, frustrated by a poor quality sheet that's difficult to write on. "The ink is too thin," notes another. "It is very cold today," writes a scribe working in winter. "My hand is cramped," says another. "New parchment. Bad ink. I say nothing more," states one cryptic note. These marginal notes give us a glimpse into the lived experience of the scribes, their frustrations and discomforts, and they remind us that these were real people doing difficult work under less than ideal conditions. The work is tedious. Hour after hour, day after day, you sit at your desk, copying. Your hand cramps. The muscles in your shoulders and back ache from the sustained posture. Your eyes strain from focusing on the fine details of the letter. In winter, despite being in the warming room, you're still cold and your fingers are stiff and clumsy. In summer, the heat makes you drowsy, and flies buzz around your head, occasionally landing on the wet ink and having to be carefully shooed away without smudging your work. But there's also deep satisfaction in this work. You're creating something beautiful and lasting. The page in front of you, with its neat rows of text, its careful script, is a testament to your skill and dedication. You know that this book will outlast you. Long after you're dead and buried in the monastery cemetery, this book will exist. People you'll never meet will read these words that you're copying. And in that sense, your work connects you to the future, makes you part of something larger and more enduring than your individual life. Some scribes were extraordinarily fast and productive. We have records of monks who copied entire Bibles in a year, an astonishing feat when you consider that a Bible might contain over 700,000 words. That's copying roughly 2,000 words per day, every single day, maintaining consistent quality and accuracy. These champion scribes were celebrated in their monasteries, their prowess recognized and admired. But not everyone was fat. Some monks were slow, painstaking, taking months to complete a single gospel book. Speed wasn't the only measure of worth. Accuracy mattered. Beauty mattered. Some of the slower scribes produced the most exquisite work, manuscripts of breathtaking loveliness, where every letter is perfectly formed, where the spacing is impeccable, where the overall effect is one of harmony and grace. The types of books produced in monastery scriptoria were varied. Obviously, religious texts were primary. Bibles, both complete Bibles and individual books of the Bible, copied separately. Gospel books, as we discussed, psalters, books containing the Psalms, which every monk needed for the divine office. Lectionaries, books containing the scripture readings appointed for each day of the liturgical year. Sacramentaries, books containing the prayers for Mass. Lives of saints were popular. Medieval people loved stories of the saints, these men and women who had lived heroically holy lives. Reading, or hearing about Saint Martin sharing his cloak with a beggar, or Saint Benedict confronting demons, or Saint Anthony enduring temptations in the desert. These stories inspired and encouraged monks in their own struggles. Theological works were copied too. The writings of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, Ambrose. These were the great teachers of the Church, and their works were studied carefully. Commentaries on Scripture, explaining difficult passages, treatises on prayer, on the spiritual life, on how to live as a Christian. But monasteries didn't copy only religious texts. They also preserved classical learning, the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors. Many of the texts we have today from the classical world survived only because monks copied them. Virgil's poetry, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Cicero's speeches and philosophical works, works on agriculture, on medicine, on architecture. Now, some of these classical texts contained content that was problematic from a Christian perspective. Ovid's tales of the pagan gods and their often immoral behavior, Virgil's Aeneid with its pagan worldview. But medieval scholars found ways to interpret these works allegorically, to read Christian meanings into pagan texts, or simply to value them for their literary merit and the knowledge they contained while setting aside the religious elements. The monasteries were in effect the libraries and archives of the early medieval world, in an era when literacy was rare. When books were expensive and scarce, monasteries were the places where books were collected, preserved, and copied. Without the monasteries, much of our classical heritage would have been lost. The manuscripts would have decayed, the knowledge forgotten. This preservation wasn't always intentional or systematic. Monasteries didn't necessarily think of themselves as guardians of culture for future civilizations. They copied what they needed, what they found useful or edifying. But the cumulative effect of hundreds of monasteries, each maintaining a library and a scriptorium, each copying books, was that knowledge was preserved through a very difficult period in European history. Let's talk about illumination, because this is where the scriptorium work becomes truly artistic. An illuminated manuscript is one that has been decorated, that includes illustrations or decorative elements beyond the text itself. The simplest form of illumination is the decorated initial, an enlarged and ornamented first letter at the beginning of a section or chapter. Instead of just writing a plain I to begin in principio, you might draw a large I several lines tall, and inside it or around it, you might add decoration, geometric patterns, interlaced lines, stylized foliage, animal forms. The decoration style varied by region and period. Irish manuscripts, like the Book of Kells, featured incredibly intricate interlaced patterns, Celtic knots of stunning complexity. Continental manuscripts might feature acanthus leaves, a classical motif borrowed from Roman art. English manuscripts often included wonderful little creatures lurking in the margins, dogs and rabbits and birds and strange hybrid beasts. Some manuscripts included miniatures, small paintings illustrating scenes from the text. A gospel book might have portraits of the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each shown writing his gospel. A psalter might have illustrations of key scenes from the life of David. A book of hours, a prayer book for private devotion, might have dozens of miniatures illustrating biblical scenes, the life of Mary, the saints. Creating these illuminations required different skills from copying text. The illuminator needed to be an artist, able to draw, to compose a scene, to mix colors, to apply gold leaf. Some monasteries had monks who specialized in this work. In other cases, the scribe who copied the text might also do the illumination, though this was less common because the skill sets were different. The process of creating an illuminated page was complex. First, the text would be copied, leaving blank spaces where illuminations were to go. The illuminator would sketch his design lightly, perhaps with a lead point, or with very faint ink. Then he would begin applying color, usually working from light to dark, building up layers. Gold was applied early in the process. The illuminator would prepare the area to receive the gold by applying a base, sometimes a colored base, red or yellow, that would show through the gold and make it more vibrant. Then came the gold itself. If using gold leaf, he would apply a thin layer of adhesive, typically made from egg white or fish glue, then carefully place the extremely thin sheet of gold leaf onto the adhesive. Gold leaf is so thin it's almost weightless, and it has to be handled delicately, or it will tear. Once the gold was in place, it would be burnished, polished with a smooth tool, often a piece of agate or a wolf's tooth, to make it shine. Well-burnished gold in a manuscript can still gleam brilliantly after 1,000 years. Then came the painting with colored pigments. The blue from lapis lazuli was applied. This blue, called ultramarine, beyond the sea because lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, was the most expensive pigment, more costly than gold. It was reserved for the most important elements of a painting, often for the robes of the Virgin Mary. Other pigments were less expensive, but still required skill to use. The green from verdigris could be corrosive, potentially damaging the parchment over time if applied too thickly or in too concentrated a form. The red from vermilion or red lead was stable and reliable. Yellow from orpiment was bright but toxic. The illuminator mixed his pigments with binding agents, typically egg yolk or gum arabic, creating a paint that could be applied with fine brushes. The brushes themselves were made from animal hair, perhaps squirrel or ermine, down to wooden handles. Very fine detail work required very fine brushes, sometimes with only a few hairs. The work was slow and exacting. A full-page illumination might take days or even weeks to complete. Every detail had to be carefully considered and executed. The folds of a robe, the expression on a face, the delicate leaves of a decorative border, all of these required patience and skill. Some illuminated manuscripts are so magnificent they take your breath away. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created in the early 700s on an island off the coast of England. Every page is a work of art, with carpet pages, geometric designs of incredible intricacy, and illuminated initials of stunning beauty. The Book of Kells, made in Ireland or Scotland around 800 CE, with its wild, exuberant decoration, its weird and wonderful creatures, its pages that invite you to look closer and closer, always finding new details you hadn't noticed before. These masterpieces represent hundreds or thousands of hours of labor. They were created as offerings to God, as ways of honoring the sacred texts they contained. The beauty was meant to elevate the soul, to create a sense of wonder and reverence. When you opened a gospel book and saw the portrait of Matthew, his halo gleaming with gold, his robes painted in rich blues and reds, you were reminded that these were not just words on a page, but the very word of God, and they deserved to be honored with the finest craftsmanship human hands could produce. Not every manuscript was illuminated to this degree. Most were much simpler, with perhaps just a few decorated initials and some basic ornamental element. The really elaborate manuscripts were typically commissioned for important churches or wealthy patrons, and they represented a significant investment of resources. But even a simple manuscript, unilluminated, still represented substantial work. Consider the economics of it. The parchment had to be made or purchased. The ink had to be prepared. The scribe had to be fed and clothed and housed while he worked. A single book might represent weeks or months of labor. This is why books were so valuable, why they were often chained to lecterns in churches to prevent theft, why they were listed in monastery inventories along with the gold chalices and silver candlesticks. The scriptorium was also a place of learning. When you copied a text, you were also reading it, engaging with it intellectually. The act of copying forced you to pay attention to every word. You couldn't just skim. You had to process each sentence, understand its grammar and meaning, at least enough to copy it accurately. For monks who were still learning Latin, and many came to the monastery with only basic Latin or none at all. Copying manuscripts was educational. You learned vocabulary, grammar, syntax. You absorbed the style and rhetoric of classical and patristic authors. Over years of copying, you became learned, not through formal study necessarily, but through this constant exposure to texts. Some monks went beyond just copying and became scholars in their own right. They wrote commentaries on the texts they copied. They compiled reference works, encyclopedias that gathered together knowledge on various subjects. They corresponded with scholars in other monasteries, exchanging ideas and information. The Venerable Bede, an English monk who lived from 6072 to 735, is a great example. He spent his entire life in monasteries in Northumbria, yet he became one of the most learned men of his age. He wrote works on astronomy, grammar, chronology, most famously, his ecclesiastical history of the English people, which is our primary source for early English history. He did all this while maintaining the regular monastic life of prayer and work. His day was structured by the divine office, just like any other monks, yet he found time to produce an enormous body of scholarship. Bede's scriptorium work was part of his intellectual life. He copied manuscripts, but he also used those manuscripts as sources for his own writing. The monastery library was his resource, and he drew on it extensively. Not every monastery had a scholar of Bede's caliber, but many had at least a few monks who engaged in intellectual work beyond simple copying. They might compile sermon collections, gathering together homilies from various church fathers, organized by the liturgical year, creating resources for preaching. They might create martyrologies, calendars listing the feast days of saints with brief accounts of their lives. They might write practical works on agriculture or medicine, compiling useful information for the monastery's daily operations. The scriptorium was quiet, as I said, but it wasn't solitary in the way we might imagine. You worked in the presence of other scribes. You could see them at their desks, bent over their work. You shared the space, the light, the silence. There was a sense of camaraderie in this, a shared purpose, and occasionally, you might need help. Perhaps there's a word in the exemplar you can't quite read. The ink is faded, or smudged. You might catch the eye of the scribe next to you, an older monk who's been doing this longer, and with a gesture, ask him to look. He comes over, squints at the problematic word, recognizes it from context and experience, and signs the correct reading to you. You nod thanks, and continue, or perhaps you've run out of parchment, and you need to get more from the storage area. You use the sign for parchment, then the sign for I need, and the Amarius, the monk in charge of the library and its supplies, understands and brings you what you need. This sign language of the scriptorium was sophisticated, with gestures for all the common tools and materials. The sign for a book was made by spreading your hands as if opening a codex. The sign for ink involved touching your finger to your tongue. The sign for a pen was a writing motion in the air. Every monastery had slightly different signs, but the basic vocabulary was similar across the Benedictine world. As the day progresses, the light changes. Morning light gives way to the bright light of midday, which can be too intense, creating glare and harsh shadows. Many scribes prefer to work in the morning or late afternoon when the light is softer and more even. On cloudy days, the light is actually quite good, diffuse and steady without sharp shadows. In winter, the short days are a challenge. You have perhaps 6 or 7 hours of good light, and you try to make the most of it. You work as long as you can, until the light fails, and you can no longer see clearly enough to write accurately. Then you put away your tools, clean your pen, cap your inkhorn, cover your work to protect it from dust, and you move on to other tasks. In summer, the long days give you more working time, but the heat can be oppressive. The scriptorium becomes stuffy, and you sweat over your work. A drop of sweat falling on the parchment can ruin hours of labor, so you're careful dabbing your forehead frequently with a cloth. The bell rings for sex, and you stop your work. You've been writing for perhaps 3 hours since termes, and you've completed maybe 2 pages. That's good progress. The text is clean, the letters well formed. You're satisfied. You join the procession to the church for the midday office. After sex comes dinner, and after dinner, a brief rest. Then back to the scriptorium for the afternoon work period. By vespers, you've completed 4 pages total for the day. Your hand is tired, the muscles cramped from gripping the pen for so many hours. Your eyes are tired too. You look forward to the evening, to vespers and compline, to the time when you can rest. But you also look forward to tomorrow, to sitting down at your desk again, to continuing the work. There's a rhythm to it, a satisfaction in the steady progress. Each day brings you closer to completing the manuscript. When it's done, it will be bound, perhaps in leather covers over wooden boards, perhaps decorated with metal fittings, or even jewels if it's a particularly important book. And then it will go out into the world. It might stay in your monastery's library, adding to the collection, or it might be sent to another monastery that requested it, spreading knowledge across distances. Or it might be given to a newly founded church that needs books for its liturgy. Wherever it goes, it carries with it the labor of your hands, your attention, your care. It's your contribution to the great project of preserving and transmitting the wisdom of the past to the future. In a world where most things are temporary, where buildings crumble, and crops are consumed, and even human lives are brief, books endure. The words you're copying today might still be read 1,000 years from now. That's a kind of immortality, a way of leaving a mark on the world that extends far beyond your individual lifespan. And so, you work, day after day, copying the words that others copied before you, and that others will copy after you, maintaining the chain of transmission that links the past to the present, to the future. It's holy work, this preservation of knowledge. It's a form of prayer, an offering of your time and skill to God and to the community of scholars and believers that extends across space and time. The scriptorium is where the mind and the hand work together in service of something greater than themselves. It's where beauty and utility, it's where the heritage of the past is handed on to the future. And for a monk working here, it's a daily reminder that his life, lived within these monastery walls, has meaning and purpose that extends far beyond what he can see or imagine. Outside the scriptorium, beyond the quiet work of copying manuscripts, there's another kind of labor that fills the monastic day: physical work, manual labor, the kind of work that makes your muscles ache and your hands rough, that leaves you tired in a different way than the mental fatigue of scholarship. The rule of Saint Benedict is very clear about this. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Benedict writes, therefore the brothers should have specified periods for manual labor as well as for prayerful reading. He establishes a balance, what comes to be known by the Latin phrase ora et labora, pray and work. Both are essential. Both are holy. Let's walk through the various kinds of work that occupy monks throughout the day and throughout the year, and let's pay attention to how this work changes with the seasons, how it connects the monastery to the rhythms of nature and the cycles of the agricultural year. We'll start in the garden, because the garden is central to monastic life. Every monastery has extensive gardens, and much of the food the community eats comes from these carefully tended plots of earth. Picture yourself in the kitchen garden on a morning in late spring. The sun is warm but not yet hot. There's a gentle breeze. The garden is laid out in neat rectangular beds, separated by paths of packed earth or gravel. Each bed is dedicated to a particular crop or group of crops. You're assigned to garden duty today, along with several other monks. You gather your tools from the garden shed: hose, rakes, perhaps a wooden bucket for watering. The tools are simple but well maintained, their wooden handles worn smooth from years of use, their metal parts kept clean and sharp. Brother Gardener, the monk in charge of the gardens, directs the work. He's an older man who has been tending these gardens for decades. He knows the soil, knows which areas drain well, and which tend to stay wet. He knows when to plant and when to harvest. He knows which plants grow well together, and which should be kept separate. This knowledge has been passed down to him from previous gardeners, and he will pass it on to those who come after him. Today's task is weeding and thinning. The vegetables planted several weeks ago have sprouted and are growing well, but so are the weeds. You kneel beside a bed of onions, and you begin the careful work of pulling weeds while leaving the young onion plants undisturbed. It's detailed work, requiring attention. You have to distinguish between the thin, grass-like onion shoots and the various weeds that are trying to establish themselves. Your fingers work through the soil, pulling gently. The earth is cool and slightly damp from last night's dew. It smells rich, alive. There's something deeply satisfying about this direct contact with the soil, with growing things. After hours bent over a manuscript in the scriptorium, using only your eyes and your writing hand, this full-body engagement with physical work feels good. The weeds pile up beside you. After you've worked through a section, you gather them and carry them to the compost heap, where they'll rot down and eventually be returned to the garden as fertilizer. Nothing is wasted. Everything cycles back. The kitchen garden grows the staples of the monastic diet. Onions and leeks, essential for flavoring the soups and stews that make up most meals. Cabbage, which stores well and can be eaten through much of the winter. Beans and peas, good sources of protein in a diet that includes little meat. Beets, turnips, parsnips, root vegetables that can be harvested late and stored. Fillet and starred. Lettuce and other greens for salads in spring and summer. Herbs for cooking and for medicine. Each crop has its own requirements, its own schedule. Some are planted in early spring as soon as the ground can be worked. Others wait until later when the danger of frost has passed. Some will be harvested young and eaten fresh. Others will be left to mature fully, then harvested all at once and stored for winter. Brother Gardener understands all of this intuitively. When you have a question about whether a plant looks healthy or not, he comes over and examines it. He can tell from the color of the leaves, from their size and shape, whether the plant is thriving or struggling. Too much water, and the leaves might yellow. Too little, and they'll wilt. Pest damage looks different from disease. He's learned to read these signs over years of patient observation. The work continues through the morning. The sun climbs higher. You move from the onions to another bed where carrots need thinning. The carrot seeds were sown thickly, and now the seedlings are too crowded. You pull every other one, or every third one, giving the remaining plants room to develop. The tiny carrots you pull are barely the size of your finger, but they're edible, and they'll be added to the pot at dinner. Nothing wasted. By the time the bell rings for Turthy, you've worked through several beds. Your knees are sore from kneeling. Your back aches from bending over. But the beds look neat and well tended, and you can see that the vegetables are growing vigorously. In a few weeks there will be lettuce to harvest. In a few months, the beans will be producing. The cabbages will be heading up. There's a deep satisfaction in this. You're not just doing abstract intellectual work, or offering prayers that float up to heaven. You're producing food, concrete and tangible, that will nourish your community. Your labor directly supports the physical life of the monastery. After Turthy, you might continue in the garden, or you might be assigned to other outdoor work. Perhaps it's time to check the orchard. The monastery's orchards are located slightly away from the main buildings, perhaps on a hillside that gets good sun. There are apple trees, pear trees, possibly plums or cherries depending on the climate. These trees were planted years ago, perhaps decades ago. Fruit trees take time to establish and mature, so planting an orchard is an act of faith and long-term thinking. The monks who planted these trees knew they probably wouldn't live to see them at full production, but they planted them anyway for the benefit of future generations. In late spring, the fruit trees might be blooming, and the orchard is beautiful, filled with white and pink blossoms. You walk among the trees, checking their health, looking for signs of disease or pest damage, noting which trees are blooming prolifically and which seem less vigorous. If it's later in the summer, you might be harvesting. Apple harvest is particularly labor-intensive. The apples ripen at different times, so you have to go through the orchard multiple times, picking the fruit that's ready and leaving the rest to mature. You carry baskets, filling them with apples, then bringing them back to the storage area where they'll be sorted. Some apples are eaten fresh, but most are stored for winter use or processed in various ways. The best ones are carefully laid out in the storage cellar, in a cool, dark place where they'll keep for months. Others might be sliced and dried, preserved for winter. Some are pressed for cider, a drink that, like ale, is safer than water and that provides calories and nutrition through the cold months. The work of the orchard continues through the seasons. In winter, when the trees are dormant, there's pruning to be done. Dead or diseased branches need to be removed. The shape of the tree needs to be maintained, keeping the center open so light and air can reach all parts of the tree. Pruning is skilled work, and it's typically done by monks who have experience and training. A bad pruning cut can damage a tree or reduce its fruit production for years. Beyond the gardens and orchards, there are fields. The monastery owns land, sometimes quite extensive holdings, and this land needs to be worked. Some of this work is done by lay workers, peasants from nearby villages who owe labor service to the monastery in exchange for the right to work small plots of land for themselves. But monks also work in the fields, particularly during the busy seasons of planting and harvest. Let's imagine you're working in the fields during harvest time. Late summer, the grain, perhaps wheat or barley, or rye, has ripened and needs to be brought in before rain damages it or before it becomes overripe and the grain shatters and falls to the ground. Harvest is all hands-on-deck time. Even monks who normally work in the scriptorium or in administrative roles come out to the fields. The work is urgent. Weather can change quickly, and a good crop can be ruined by a sudden storm. Everyone works long hours, from dawn until dusk, to get the grain safely harvested and stored. You're given a sickle, a curved blade attached to a short handle. The technique is to grasp a handful of grain stalks with one hand and cut through them with the sickle held in the other hand. It's rhythmic work. Grasp and cut, moving steadily down the rows. The cut stalks are laid in piles, and later they'll be gathered and bound into sheaves. The work is hot. The sun beats down. Sweat soaks through your habit. Your hands develop blisters from gripping the sickle and the rough grain stalks. Your back aches from the constant bending, but there's also a kind of exhilaration to it. You're a part of a team, everyone working together toward a common goal. The field that was golden with standing grain in the morning is slowly transformed, row by row, into a stubble field dotted with sheaves. At midday you break for the main meal, but it's brief, a quick blessing. Simple food eaten in the field, and then back to work. The bell rings for sex, but today the office is shortened, and some monks stay in the field, their work being their prayer for this day. By evening, a significant portion of the field has been harvested. The sheaves are gathered and stacked into larger structures called stooks, or shocks, arranged so air can circulate through them and dry the grain. They'll stand in the field for a while, drying, before being brought into the barn. When the bell rings for vespers, you're exhausted. Every muscle aches. Your hands are stiff and sore. But there's satisfaction too. The work is good work, necessary work, and you've contributed your share. The harvested grain will be threshed later, beaten with flails to separate the grain from the chaff. Then it will be winnowed, tossed in the air so the wind carries away the lighter chaff and the heavier grain falls back down. Finally, it will be stored in the granary, the monastery's food security for the coming year. A good harvest means the community will eat well through the winter. A poor harvest means lean times, smaller portions, perhaps even hunger. The monks are not isolated from the basic realities of agricultural life. They depend on the land, on the weather, on their own labor, for survival. Let's shift to another kind of work. The workshops. Every monastery has workshops where various crafts are practiced. There's the carpentry workshop, where furniture is built and repaired, where tools are made and maintained. There's the smithy, where metal is worked, where tools are sharpened and new tools are forged. There might be a pottery where vessels for kitchen use are made. There might be a workshop for making candles, essential for lighting the church and other buildings during the long dark hours. Imagine you're assigned to the carpentry workshop for a period. You're apprenticed to Brother Carpenter, learning the skills of working with wood. The workshop smells of sawdust and wood shavings. There are benches with various tools, saws, chisels, planes, hammers. There are pieces of wood in various stages of being worked. A table leg being shaped, boards being planned smooth for a new door, repairs waiting to be made on damaged furniture. Brother Carpenter is teaching you to make a joint, a mortise and tenon that will connect two pieces of wood strongly and permanently. He shows you how to mark the wood accurately, how to cut the tenon, how to chisel out the mortise. His movements are practiced, efficient. He makes it easy, but when you try, you find it's much harder than it appears. Your first attempt is clumsy. The joint doesn't fit properly. Brother Carpenter examines your work, points out where you went wrong, shows you how to correct it. He's patient, recognizing that skill comes only through practice and repeated failure. Over days and weeks, you get better. Your joints fit more tightly. Your cuts are cleaner. You begin to understand how wood behaves, how different woods have different properties. Oak is strong and durable, but hard to work. Pine is softer, easier to cut, but less durable. The grain of the wood matters, affecting how it splits and how it takes finish. The work is satisfying in a different way than garden work or field work. You're creating objects that will last for years, perhaps decades. A well-made table, or chest, or door might still be in use a century from now. There's pride in craftsmanship, in doing work well. And this work, like all work in the monastery, is understood in spiritual terms. You're not just making a table. You're offering your labor to God. You're serving your community by providing necessary objects. And you're developing virtue, patience, attention to detail, humility to accept correction, perseverance to keep practicing until you get it right. The rule of Saint Benedict specifically says that craftsmen in the monastery should practice their crafts with humility, and if they become proud of their skill, they should be removed from that work. The point isn't to become the best carpenter for the sake of your own glory. The point is to do good work in service to the community and to God. In the smithy, the work is hot and loud. The forge burns constantly during working hours, fed with charcoal to maintain the intense heat needed to work iron. The smith heats a piece of iron in the forge until it glows red, then brings it to the anvil and hammers it, shaping it while it's hot. The ringing of hammer on anvil echoes through the workspace. Blacksmithing is specialized work, requiring years of trainings. Not every monastery has a skilled smith among its members. Some monasteries hire a lay blacksmith who lives on monastery grounds and works for the community. Others train one of the monks in the craft, sending him to another monastery to learn or having him work under an experienced smith. The smith makes and repairs tools, hoes and rakes for the garden, plowshares for the fields, knives for the kitchen, barrel hoops, nails, hinges. He might also make decorative objects, iron fittings for doors, candlesticks, perhaps even the bells that call the community to prayer. Iron is valuable. Old, worn-out tools aren't discarded, but are brought to the smithy to be remade into something else. A broken hoe can be reforged into a knife. Bent nails can be straightened and reused. This constant recycling of materials is necessary in an economy where metal is expensive, and most things are made locally rather than purchased from distant suppliers. The brewery is another important workspace. Every monastery brews its own ale or beer, and this is a substantial operation. The brewing process begins with malting grain, usually barley. The grain is soaked in water, allowed to sprout, then dried in a kiln. This converts the starches in the grain to sugars that can be fermented. The malted grain is then milled, crushed into a coarse powder. The crushed malt is mixed with hot water in a large vessel, creating a porridge-like mixture called the mash. The hot water extracts the sugars from the malt. After some time, the liquid, now called wort, is drained off. The wort is boiled, often with herbs added for flavoring. In later periods, hops become the standard flavoring for beer. But in the early medieval period, various other herbs might be used. Yarrow, bog myrtle, heather. After boiling, the wort is cooled and transferred to fermentation vessels, and yeast is added. The yeast, though monks don't understand the microbiology of it, converts the sugars to alcohol. The fermentation process takes several days, and the resulting beer is relatively weak, perhaps 3 or 4% alcohol, meant for daily drinking rather than intoxication. The monastery brews in large batches, producing enough to supply the community for weeks or months. The beer is stored in wooden barrels in a cool cellar. Each monk receives a daily allowance. The rule of Saint Benedict specifies a reasonable amount, about half a liter per day, enough to be hydrating and nutritious, without leading to drunkenness. The brewery is warm and humid, filled with the yeasty smell of fermentation. The monks who work here develop expertise in the process, learning to judge when the fermentation is complete, how to maintain the cleanliness of the equipment, how to prevent spoilage. Beer that goes bad, that sours or develops off flavors, is a serious problem. It represents wasted grain, wasted labor. So, the brewers take their work seriously, maintaining standards of cleanliness and technique. In the bakery, bread is made daily. The monastery consumes enormous quantities of bread. It's the staple of the diet, present at every meal. The bakers rise very early, well before lauds, to start the ovens and begin the day's baking. The process is straightforward, but labor-intensive. Flour, water, salt, and leaven, the sourdough starter that's been kept alive and fed continuously, propagating yeast cultures from batch to batch. These ingredients are mixed into a dough kneaded until smooth and elastic, then left to rise. The risen dough is shaped into loaves and baked in the large communal ovens. The smell of baking bread permeates the monastery. A warm, comforting smell. That means home, nourishment, life. Fresh bread is one of the small pleasures of monastic life, and the bakers take satisfaction in producing good loaves, well risen and golden brown. Some monasteries mill their own grain, operating a water mill or a mill powered by animals walking in a circle. The mill grinds the grain into flour, and this too is skilled work. The millstones need to be maintained, dressed periodically to keep them cutting efficiently. The flow of water, or the pace of the animals, needs to be managed. Too fast, and the flour overheat, damaging its quality. Too slow, and the process is inefficient. All of these various kinds of work, in the gardens and fields, in the workshops and the brewery, and the bakery, create the material basis for monastic life. The monastery is largely self-sufficient, producing most of what it needs within its own walls and on its own lands. This self-sufficiency is partly practical. a response to the economic realities of the early medieval world where trade is limited and money is scarce. But it's also philosophical, reflecting a commitment to simplicity, to not being dependent on the outside world more than necessary, to providing for your own needs through your own labor. The balance between different kinds of work shifts with the seasons. In spring there's planting. The fields need to be plowed and sown. The gardens need to be prepared and planted. This is busy time, but the work is spaced out over weeks. Summer brings maintenance work, weeding the gardens, tending the growing crops. Repairs to buildings that were deferred during winter can now be undertaken. Roofs that leaked need to be fixed. Walls that were damaged by winter weather need to be mended. Late summer and autumn are dominated by harvest. Grain harvest, as we discussed, but also the harvest of fruits and vegetables, apples and pears from the orchard, late vegetables from the garden. This is when the monastery storerooms are filled, preparing for winter. Winter is quieter for outdoor work. The fields lie fallow, the gardens are dormant, but there's still work to be done. Firewood needs to be cut and split, an ongoing task that employs monks throughout the cold month. Indoor work increases. More time in the scriptorium, more time in the workshops, making and repairing things. The cycle of the seasons becomes deeply familiar. You know that autumn means harvest, that winter means long hours of darkness and indoor work, that spring means the garden comes alive again with new growth, that summer means long days of labor under the sun. This connection to the rhythms of nature is grounding. You're reminded constantly that you're a part of the created world, dependent on sun and rain and the turning of the earth. Your spirituality is not abstract or disconnected from physical reality. It's embodied, literally connected to the soil and the seasons. There's a theological dimension to this too. Work, manual labor, is seen as participation in God's creative activity. God created the world and called it good. When you garden, you're tending God's creation. When you build something, you're using the materials God has provided, the wood and stone and metal of the earth, and transforming them into something useful. The curse of Adam in Genesis, condemned to till the soil by the sweat of your brow, is redeemed in Christian understanding. Work is no longer just punishment. It's opportunity, a way of serving God in community, a way of participating in the ongoing work of creation and redemption. This is why Benedict insists on manual labor for all monks, even those who are educated and could spend all their time in intellectual pursuits. Everyone needs to work with their hands to stay connected to the physical realities of existence, to avoid the pride that can come from purely intellectual work. And there's something humbling and democratizing about this. The abbot might come from a noble family, but he still works in the garden alongside former peasants. The scholar who can read Greek and Latin still takes his turn in the kitchen, washing dishes. Everyone shares in the labor, and this creates a sense of equality and community that transcends whatever social distinctions existed in the outside world. The work also provides variety and relief. If you spend all day every day in the scriptorium, you might go a bit mad, straining your eyes and mind. But spending some time in the garden, using your body, breathing fresh air, provides balance. The physical tiredness from manual labor is different from mental fatigue, and in some ways it's more satisfying. You can see what you've accomplished: the weeded bed, the repaired door, the stack of firewood. There's a concreteness to it that intellectual or spiritual work sometimes lacks. As the day draws toward evening, as the light begins to fade, the various work assignments conclude. Tools are cleaned and put away. The garden is left tidy. The workshop is swept. Everything is prepared for the next day. You wash your hands and face, cleaning off the dirt and sweat of the day's labor. Your body is tired, pleasantly so. You worked hard, and you feel it in your muscles. The bell rings for vespers, and you make your way to the church. You stand in your place in the choir, and you begin to sing. Your voice blends with the others, and the psalms echo off the stone walls. You crown the year with your bounty, goes one of the psalms. The meadows clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain. They shout and sing together for joy. And you understand these words in a new way because you've been part of that process. You've planted the grain, you've tended it, you've harvested it. You've seen the cycle from seed to harvest to bread. The psalm isn't abstract poetry. It's describing the reality of your life, the work of your hands, the provisions God has made for your need. This integration of prayer and work, of contemplation and action, of spiritual and physical, is at the heart of Benedictine monasticism. You don't choose between prayer and work. You do both, and each enriches the other. Your work becomes prayer, offered to God, and your prayer informs your work, reminding you why you labor, for whom you labor, what it all means. As you finish Vespers and move toward the evening meal, you're conscious of the food you'll eat. Bread that came from grain you perhaps helped harvest. Vegetables from the garden you helped tend. Ale from the brewery where you or your brothers worked. Nothing is taken for granted. Everything is recognized as gift, as the fruit of labor, as provision from God who gives the sun and rain that makes all growth possible. And tomorrow, you'll rise again, attend the offices of prayer, and return to work. The weeds will have grown overnight, and they'll need pulling again. There will be more grain to thresh, more wood to split, more repairs to make. The work is never completely finished, but that's not the point. The point is the doing of it, day by day, faithfully and well, as an offering and a practice, and a way of life. We've talked about the external rhythms of monastic life, the prayers and work that structure the day. But beneath all of this, there's something else, something harder to describe, but perhaps more important. The inner life, the cultivation of the soul, the slow, often difficult work of becoming holy. This is what drew many monks to the monastery in the first place. Not the routine, not the security, but the possibility of transformation. The hope that by dedicating your life to God, by following a rule of life designed to shape you spiritually, you might become something more than you currently are. That you might over years and decades grow in virtue, in wisdom, in holiness. Let's explore this interior dimension of monastic life, gently and thoughtfully, because it's complex and deeply personal. We'll start with Lectio Divina, sacred reading, because this is one of the primary spiritual practices of the monk. Alongside the divine office and manual labor, imagine yourself in the cloister on a quiet afternoon. You've finished your work assignment for the day. The next office won't be for another hour. You have time, blessed time, for Lectio. You're holding a book, perhaps a copy of the Gospels, or the Psalms, or perhaps a work by one of the church fathers. The book is precious, and you handle it carefully. You find a place to sit, perhaps on a stone bench in the cloister walkway, where the light is good. You open the book and begin to read. But this isn't reading as we typically think of it. You're not trying to get through a certain number of pages. You're not reading for information or to complete an assignment. This is something different. Lectio Divina has 4 movements, though they're not always clearly distinguished, and they often flow into one another organically. First is Lectio itself, the reading. You read slowly, very slowly. You might spend 10 minutes on a single paragraph, or even a single sentence. You're not skimming, you're tasting each word, letting it sit on your tongue, so to speak. You're reading with your whole being, not just with your intellect. Let's say you're reading from the Gospel of John. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. You read this sentence once, then again. You notice the words, bread of life. What does that mean? You think about bread, the bread you eat every day at every meal, how it sustains you, gives you energy, keeps you alive. Jesus is saying he's like that, but for the soul rather than the body. Never be hungry. You think about hunger, both physical and spiritual. The hunger you feel when you've been working all day, and mealtime is still hours away. The deeper hunger, the sense that something is missing, that you're looking for something you can't quite name. The second movement is meditation. Meditation. This is when you start to chew on the words, to turn them over in your mind. You're not analyzing them academically, breaking down the Greek grammar or comparing different manuscripts. You're asking, what is this saying to me? What is God saying to me through these words? You might think about times you felt spiritually hungry, times when the routine of monastic life felt dry and empty, when the prayers seemed meaningless and you wondered why you were even here. And this promise, whoever comes to me will never be hungry, speaks to that hunger. It offers something. Or maybe you're not feeling particularly hungry right now. Maybe things are going well, but you remember times of struggle, and you think about your brothers who might be struggling now, and the words take on meaning that way. The meditation isn't forced. You're not trying to squeeze meaning out of the text. You're simply being present with it, allowing it to work on you, to speak to you. The third movement is adoration, prayer. This is when the reading becomes conversation. You start to talk to God about what you've read, about what it's stirring in you. Lord, I am hungry. I do hunger for you, though sometimes I don't realize it. I fill my life with work and routines, but underneath, there's this hunger. Feed me. Be the bread of life for me. Or perhaps, thank you for feeding me, for providing not just physical bread, but spiritual nourishment. For the community, for the liturgy, for these quiet moments of reading and prayer. The prayer is personal, direct, honest. You're not trying to pray beautifully or correctly. You're simply responding to God out of what the reading has awakened in you. The fourth movement is contemplation. Contemplation. This is the quietest movement, and it's hard to describe. The reading and meditating and praying naturally quiet down, and you're simply resting in God's presence. Not thinking much, not saying much, just being. You're still holding the book, but you're not reading anymore. Your eyes might be open, looking at nothing in particular, or they might be closed. Time passes, though you're not very aware of it. There's a deep peace, a sense of being held, of being loved, of being exactly where you're supposed to be. This contemplative rest might last a few minutes or longer. Eventually, gradually, you come back to yourself. The bell will ring soon for the next office. You close the book gently, return it to its place, and make your way to the church. This is Lectio Divina in its fullness, though not every session reaches contemplation. Sometimes you stay in the reading and meditation, never quite moving into prayer or rest. That's fine. The practice isn't about achieving a particular state. It's about showing up, being present with Scripture, being open to however God might speak to you through it. The practice requires patience. In our modern world, we're used quick results, instant information. But Lectio Divina is slow. Sometimes frustratingly slow. You might spend a month working through a single chapter of Scripture, returning to it day after day, finding new meanings, new depths. And sometimes the reading feels dry. The words don't spark anything. You read the same passage over and over, and it just sits there, inert. This dryness is part of the practice too. You don't give up. You keep showing up. Keep reading, trusting that meaning will emerge in its own time. The Church Fathers wrote extensively about spiritual reading. Saint Jerome said, "Ignorance of Scripture is ignorance of Christ." The Bible, particularly the Gospels, is how you come to know Christ. Not just know about Him, but know Him personally, intimately. And this knowing happens through slow, prayerful reading, through allowing the words to shape you over time. Beyond the formal practice of Lectio Divina, there's also time for private prayer, for simply talking to God in whatever way feels natural to you. Some monks develop elaborate prayer practices. They might meditate on the life of Christ, imaginatively placing themselves in gospel scenes, imagining themselves as one of the disciples watching Jesus teach, hearing his voice, seeing his face, or imagining themselves at the crucifixion, standing at the foot of the cross, present at that moment of ultimate sacrifice. Others pray more simply, just talking to God as they would to a friend, telling him about their day, their struggles, their gratitude. Lord, I'm tired. The work in the garden was hard today. My back aches. But thank you for the strength to do it. Thank you for the good weather. Thank you for Brother John who helped me and made the work easier with his companionship. Some monks use prayers they've memorized. The Our Father, the Hail Mary, simple prayers from the liturgy. The repetition of familiar prayers can be soothing, can create a rhythm that quiets the mind and opens the heart. The Jesus Prayer, particularly popular in Eastern Christianity but known in the West too, is incredibly simple. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Just that, repeated over and over, sometimes synchronized with breathing. Breathe in, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Breathe out, have mercy on me, a sinner. The prayer becomes automatic, running in the background of consciousness during work or even during sleep. Prayer happens in the church, in those quiet moments before or after the divine office, when you're kneeling in your choir stall. But it also happens anywhere. Walking in the cloister, working in the garden, lying in bed at night, unable to sleep. Any moment can become a moment of prayer, a moment of connection with God. The monks are also governed by the rule of silence, which profoundly shapes the inner life. From Compline until after morning mass the next day, the great silence is observed. No talking except in genuine emergency, but even during the day, unnecessary speech is discouraged. The monastery is generally a quiet place. This silence isn't just about noise reduction. It's about creating space for interior awareness. When you're constantly talking, constantly surrounded by chatter, it's easy to avoid your own thoughts and feelings, to stay on the surface of things. Silence forces you to go deeper. In silence, you become aware of what's actually going on inside you. The emotions you've been suppressing, the worries you've been avoiding, the desires you haven't acknowledged. All of this rises to the surface in silence, and you have to deal with it. This can be uncomfortable, even painful. Many monks struggle with silence, especially at first. Your mind races. You remember conversations from years ago and replay them, thinking of what you should have said. You worry about the future. You relive mistakes from the past. The mental chatter is sometimes worse than actual conversation would. But over time, with practice, the internal noise begins to settle. You learn to observe your thoughts without getting caught up in them. A worry arises, and you acknowledge it, then let it pass. A memory surfaces, and you note it, then release it. The silence deepens, becomes more peaceful. In deep silence, you can hear the still, small voice of God, the gentle presence that's always there, but usually drowned out by noise and busyness. This is what the silence is for, ultimately, not to make you uncomfortable, but to help you become attentive to God's presence and leading. The monks do have sign language for necessary communication during silent times, as we've mentioned. A gesture for pass the bread at meals. A sign for I need the rake in the garden. But these practical communications are kept to a minimum. The silence is valued and protected. There's also the practice of spiritual direction. Most monks have a spiritual father, usually the abbot or an older, experienced monk with whom they meet periodically to discuss their spiritual life. In these conversations, which take place in private and are confidential, you talk about how things are going. You might confess temptations or struggles. Father, I've been feeling a lot of anger lately. Small things irritate me. I snapped at Brother Peter yesterday over nothing. and I'm ashamed. Or, Father, my prayer feels dead. I go through the motions, but I don't feel anything. I'm worried that I'm just pretending, that I'm not really devoted to God at all. The spiritual father listens. He might ask questions, trying to understand what's happening beneath the surface. He might offer perspective, based on his own experience, or the wisdom of the tradition. What you're describing is akidia, spiritual listlessness. Many monks experience this. It will pass. Keep showing up to prayer even when it feels dead. Faithfulness in dryness is more valuable than fervor that comes easily. He might assign a penance if you've confessed a fault, not as punishment, but as medicine for the soul. For your anger, I want you to prostrate yourself at the church door before Vespers tomorrow, so your brothers have to step over you as they enter. Let this humiliation soften your pride. Or he might simply offer encouragement. You're doing well. I see your faithfulness. I see how you've grown in patience over the years. Keep going. God is working in you, even when you can't see it. These conversations are invaluable. The spiritual father knows you, knows your patterns and struggles. He can see things you can't see about yourself. He provides accountability, support, wisdom. He's been on this path longer than you have, and he can help you navigate it. But even with a spiritual father's guidance, much of the spiritual life is solitary. You're alone with God, working out your salvation with fear and trembling, as St. Paul wrote. And there are struggles. The monastic life, for all its peace and order, is not easy. You're human, with all the weaknesses and temptations that entails. There's the temptation to pride. Perhaps you're good at copying manuscripts, and you begin to think highly of your skill. You compare yourself to other scribes, and feel superior. Perhaps you're scrupulous about keeping the rule, and you look down on brothers who are less strict. Pride is insidious. It creeps in disguised as virtue. There's the temptation to anger. Living in close quarters with the same people year after year, you will be irritated. Brother Thomas chews loudly at meals, and it grates on you. Brother John always leaves his tools lying around in the workshop. Then you have to clean up after him. The abbot seems to favor certain monks over others, and you feel the sting of unfairness. These small irritations can grow into real resentment if you're not careful. There's the temptation to lust. You're celibate, but sexual desire doesn't simply disappear because you've taken vows. Dreams can be vivid and disturbing. Memories of past relationships surface unbidden. You might find yourself attracted to someone, perhaps a younger monk, and have to wrestle with feelings that have no legitimate outlet in this life you've chosen. There's the temptation to envy. Another monk is chosen for a prestigious assignment, perhaps to travel to another monastery or to attend a church council. You wanted that assignment. You feel passed over, unappreciated. Or another monk seems to have an easier time with the spiritual life. Prayer comes naturally to him. He radiates peace. You struggle, and you resent his apparent ease. There's the temptation to gluttony. The meals are simple, but you find yourself looking forward to them too much, thinking about food when you should be thinking about other things. Or perhaps there's something you particularly like, and you take more than your share, depriving others. And perhaps most dangerous, there's acedia, a word that doesn't translate neatly into English. It's sometimes called spiritual sloth, but it's more complex than simple laziness. It's a kind of listlessness, a loss of interest in spiritual things, a sense that nothing matters, that your life is meaningless, that you're wasting your time in this monastery. The Desert Fathers wrote extensively about acedia. They called it the noonday demon, because it often hits in the middle of the day, when you're tired and the afternoon stretches out endlessly before you. The monk experiencing acedia looks out his cell window and wonders if another monastery might be better. He thinks about leaving, returning to the world. He can't concentrate on prayer or reading. He becomes restless, moving from task to task, without settling into anything. Time moves with agonizing slowness. Acedia is deeply unpleasant, and it can last for weeks or months. The traditional remedy is patience and perseverance. You don't give in to the impulse to flee or change everything. You stay put. You keep going to prayer even when it feels pointless. You keep doing your work even when it seems meaningless. You endure, and eventually the cloud lifts. The acedia passes. Interest and engagement return. You're reminded why you chose this life, what drew you to the monastery in the first place. But while you're in it, while the acedia is heavy upon you, it's difficult to believe it will ever end. All of these temptations, all of these struggles, are part of the path. The monastic life doesn't eliminate them. If anything, the structure and intensity of the life can make them more acute. You can't distract yourself with entertainment or novelty. You can't escape into busyness or relationship drama. You're confronted with yourself, with your own brokenness and neediness, day after day. But this confrontation is necessary. The fathers call it spiritual warfare. You're fighting against your own disordered desires, your attachments, your ego, and the fight is real, sometimes exhausting. The weapons in this warfare are the spiritual practices we've discussed: prayer, reading, work, community, the sacraments, confession and the Eucharist, fasting and self-discipline, obedience to the rule and to the abbot. You confess your faults in the chapter meeting or privately to the abbot. The confession itself is purifying, bringing your failures into the light, acknowledging them before God and your brothers. This breaks the power of shame and secrecy. The penance you receive helps reorient you toward virtue. You receive the Eucharist regularly, this mysterious sacrament where bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. You don't fully understand it. The theology is beyond you, but you experience it as nourishment, as grace, as Christ himself entering into you and transforming you from the inside. You fast, not just during Lent, but at other times too. The abbot might assign fasting as a penance, or you might take it on voluntarily as a discipline. The hunger you feel reminds you of your dependence on God. It weakens the body's demands, making it easier to focus on spiritual things. It's a form of self-denial, of saying no to legitimate desires, practicing the larger no you've said to the world. You practice obedience, even when it's difficult, even when you think your way would be better. The abbot assigns you to work in the stables when you wanted to be in the scriptorium. You go to the stables without complaining. This dying to your own will, this constant surrender, this is at the heart of the monastic path. Over time, slowly, almost imperceptibly, these practices work on you. You find that you're less reactive. Something that would have angered you 5 years ago now barely registers. You find that you're more patient, more capable of extending kindness even when you're tired or stressed. You find that the periods of dry prayer are less distressing because you've learned that they pass, that they're part of the rhythm. The fathers talk about stages of spiritual growth. You begin as a beginner, struggling with obvious sins and temptation. With practice and grace, you move into a more advanced stage where the struggles become subtler. You're no longer tempted by gross sins, but by more refined forms of pride and attachment. And eventually, if you're faithful over many years, you might reach something like spiritual maturity, a state of relative peace and stability. But even the most advanced monks experience struggles. Holiness doesn't mean the absence of temptation. It means the ability to recognize temptation quickly and resist it more effectively. It means falling less often, and when you do fall, getting up more quickly with less self-recrimination. Some monks have what might be called mystical experiences, moments of intense connection with God, visions, locutions, overwhelming feelings of love and union. These are grace, gifts from God that can't be earned or forced. They're also relatively rare and not the goal of the spiritual life. The goal is simpler and more foundational: to love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else, all the practices and disciplines, are in service of this love. You learn to see Christ in your brothers, especially the difficult ones. Brother Thomas, who chews loudly. You try to see Christ in him, to serve him as you would serve Christ. The abbot, who corrects you, sometimes harshly. You try to receive his correction as from Christ, trusting that God is using him to shape you. You learn to see Christ in the guests who come to the monastery, travelers who need food and shelter. The rule says explicitly that guests should be received as Christ himself. So, when a dirty, exhausted traveler arrives at the gate, you welcome him. You wash his feet if needed. You feed him. You provide him a bed. And in doing so, you're practicing love, making it concrete and embodied. You learn to see Christ in the poor. The monastery distributes alms, bread and sometimes coins, to the needy. When a beggar comes to the gate, you don't turn him away. You give from your abundance. And again, this is practice in love, in seeing the image of God in every human being, no matter how lowly. The cultivation of virtue is slow work. You're not trying to become perfect or tame. You're trying to become slightly more patient this year than last year, slightly humbler, slightly more capable of genuine love. And you fail, over and over. You lose your temper. You indulge in judgment and criticism. You slack off in your work. You skip private prayer because you're tired. But the failures aren't the end of the story. You confess. You receive forgiveness and absolution. You begin again. The motto of the Benedictine order, though it developed later, captures something essential. Always we begin again. Every day is a new beginning. Every moment is a chance to turn back to God, to choose love, to live faithfully. As you grow older in the monastic life, as years turn into decades, you might notice changes in yourself that you couldn't have planned or predicted. You've become someone different from the young man who first entered the monastery. Less anxious, perhaps. More grounded. You've learned to be at peace with yourself, with your limitations. You've learned to trust God's providence, to believe that you're held and loved even when you can't feel it. You've developed a quality that the old monks have, a kind of settledness. You're not looking for the next thing. You're not restless or dissatisfied. You're here, and this is enough. The routine that once felt constricting now feels liberating. You know what to expect. You know what's required, and within that structure, you've found freedom. This is the paradox at the heart of the monastic life. By accepting limitation, you become free. By dying to your own will, you come alive. By giving up everything, you gain everything. You might sit in the cloister on a quiet evening, after Vespers, and feel a profound gratitude for this life, for this community, for the opportunity to pursue something that matters, to dedicate yourself to something larger than your own small concerns, for the beauty of the liturgy, the psalms you've sung 10,000 times, for the work of your hands, the manuscripts you've copied, the vegetables you've grown, for your brothers, even the difficult ones, who've journeyed alongside you all these years, and most of all, for the presence of God, which has been faithful even when you haven't been, which has pursued you, drawn you, shaped you, loved you, into becoming more fully yourself, more fully human, more fully the person you were created to be. The inner life, this cultivation of the soul, is the real work of the monastery. Everything else, the prayers and the labor and the routines, all of it is in service of this interior transformation. And while you can't fully see the progress, can't fully judge whether you're actually becoming holier, you trust that God is working, that the seeds planted in your heart are growing, hidden and slow but real. And when death comes, as it will, when you lie in the infirmary surrounded by your brothers who sing the prayers for the dying, you'll be able to let go. You've spent your life learning to let go, to release your grip on your own will and your own plan. And this final letting go, this release of life itself, will be the culmination of that long practice. Your brothers will bury you in the monastery cemetery, in the earth you've tended all these years, and the community will continue without you. the cycle of prayer and work ongoing, other monks taking up the tasks you laid down, but something of you will remain. The books you copied, the stones you laid, the lessons you taught younger monks, the example of your faithfulness, and most of all the love you practiced, imperfect, but real, which participated in the great law that holds all things together and gives all things meaning. This is the inner life of the monk, hidden, mostly, from external view, but real, and in many ways the most important thing. It's easy to imagine monasteries as completely separate from the world, isolated islands of prayer and contemplation, cut off from the concerns and chaos of secular life. And there's some truth to this image. Monks do withdraw from the world. They give up families, possessions, careers, all the things that occupy most people's lives. But the monastery walls are not absolute barriers. They're more like membranes, semi-permeable. The monastery and the world influence each other in complex and sometimes surprising ways. The monk who has renounced the world still lives in it, still interacts with it, still serves it. Let's explore these connections, these relationships between the monastery and the wider medieval world. We'll start with hospitality, because this is one of the primary ways the monastery engages with outsiders. The rule of Saint Benedict is explicit and emphatic about this. All guests who present themselves are to be welcomed as Christ. Benedict writes, not just tolerated, not grudgingly accommodated, but welcomed, as Christ himself. This is a radical instruction. Medieval roads are dangerous. Travelers are often desperate, dirty, possibly carrying disease. Many are poor, with nothing to offer in return for hospitality. Some are criminals fleeing justice. But the rule makes no distinctions. All guests are to be welcomed. Every monastery has a guest house, a building or section of buildings dedicated to housing travelers. The guest master, the monk in charge of hospitality, is chosen carefully. He needs to be warm, welcoming, capable of making people feel at ease. He's often the first monk a visitor encounters, and his demeanor sets the tone for the whole experience. Imagine you're a traveler arriving at the monastery gate. As evening approaches, you've been walking all day, and you're exhausted. Your feet hurt, you're hungry and thirsty. You're not sure where you'll sleep tonight, and you're a little afraid of bandits on the roads or wild animals in the forests. You ring the bell at the gatehouse. The porter opens the small window and looks out at you. You explain that you need shelter for the night. The porter nods, opens the gate, welcomes you in. There's no interrogation, no demand for payment or credentials. You're welcomed. The porter takes you to the guest house, where the guest master greets you. He's an older monk with a kind face. He asks if you'd like water to wash. He brings a basin and towel, and if you're particularly travel-worn, he might wash your feet himself, reenacting Christ's washing of the disciples' feet. This intimate act of service, a respected monk kneeling before a dirty stranger, is both humbling and moving. After you've washed, you're shown to a room. It's simple but clean. There's a bed, a small table, perhaps a crucifix on the wall. The guest master tells you that a meal will be served shortly in the guest dining hall. You're welcome to attend Vespers in the church if you wish, though there's no obligation. The meal is simple, similar to what the monks eat, but perhaps slightly more generous. Bread, soup, cheese, ale. You eat gratefully. The food is plain but good, and after a day of travel it tastes wonderful. After the meal you're free to rest, or to explore the monastery grounds within limits. The church is always open. The cloister is usually off limits to guests, that being the most private area reserved for the monks themselves. But you can walk in the outer courtyard, visit the church, sit in the gardens, if the weather is pleasant. The next morning, you wake to the sound of bells calling the monks to prayer. You might attend Mass if you wish. Breakfast is provided, another simple meal. When you're ready to leave, the guest master sees you off. He might give you some bread for the journey. He wishes you safe travels and God's blessing. You leave the monastery feeling refreshed, cared for, reminded that there are places in this often harsh world where kindness still exists. And the monks have fulfilled their obligation, have welcomed Christ in the person of a stranger. This happens day after day, year after year. Thousands of travelers pass through a monastery over the course of decades. Some are pilgrims on their way to holy sites. Some are merchants traveling trade routes. Some are messengers carrying letters between nobles or churchmen. Some are simply poor people wandering in search of work or alms. All are welcome. The economic impact of this hospitality is significant. Feeding and housing guests requires resources. The monastery must produce or purchase extra food. The guest house must be maintained. The guest master and his assistants must spend time on this work rather than other tasks. Wealthy monasteries can absorb this cost more easily. Poor monasteries sometimes struggle, especially if they're located on major roads and receive many guests. But the obligation remains. Hospitality is not optional. It's central to the Benedictine charism, the particular way Benedictines live out their Christian commitment. Some guests stay longer than a single night. Nobles or high church officials might stay for weeks, conducting business or simply rest. These important guests receive better accommodations, perhaps a suite of rooms, finer food, more personal attention. The abbot himself might dine with them, engage them in conversation. This creates interesting dynamic. The monastery is supposed to be a place of poverty and simplicity. Yet here are lavish accommodations for wealthy visitors. The monks are supposed to be separate from worldly concerns. Yet they're hosting nobles who bring worldly politics and intrigue with them. Some monasteries navigate this tension better than others. The best maintains their spiritual integrity while still offering genuine hospitality. The worst becomes somewhat corrupted, more interested in currying favor with powerful patrons than in their spiritual mission. Beyond temporary guests, monasteries also maintain relationships with permanent patrons and benefactors. A monastery is typically founded by someone wealthy, a king or noble, who donates land and provides initial funding. This founder often retains certain rights over the monastery. He might have the right to appoint the abbot, or to be buried in the monastery church, or to receive prayers for his soul in perpetuity. The relationship between a monastery and its founder or patron is complex. The patron provides necessary support. Without wealthy benefactors, many monasteries couldn't exist. The land, the buildings, the initial community of monks, all of this requires significant resources. In return, the patron receives spiritual benefits. The monks pray for him and his family. His name is mentioned in the liturgy. When he dies, he might be buried in a place of honor in the church. And the monks will pray for his soul forever, theoretically. This is valuable in an age when people believe in purgatory, when prayers for the dead are thought to speed the soul's passage to heaven. But this relationship can become problematic. A patron might interfere in the monastery's internal affairs. He might try to place his relatives in positions of authority, regardless of their suitability. He might make demands that compromise the monastery's mission. I gave you this land. Now I expect you to support my political agenda. Good abbots navigate these relationships carefully. They accept necessary patronage while maintaining the monastery's independence as much as possible. They cultivate relationships with multiple patrons, so the monastery isn't dependent on any single one. They're diplomatic, grateful, but also firm about the monastery's primary mission. Monasteries also engage with the local community in various ways. They're often the largest landowner in a region, and this brings responsibilities and complication. The monastery owns fields, forests, mills, perhaps entire villages. The people living on monastery lands are tenants. They owe rent, usually in the form of labor or a share of their crop. They might be required to work on monastery lands several days a week. or to give the monastery a percentage of their grain harvest, or to grind their grain at the monastery's mill and pay a fee for the privilege. These economic relationships can be contentious. Tenants might feel exploited, required to give too much of their labor or produce. The monastery might feel that tenants aren't fulfilling their obligations, that they're shirking or hiding some of their harvest to avoid paying their full share. Disputes arise. A tenant claims the monastery is demanding more than what was originally agreed. The monastery claims the tenant is withholding what he owes. These disputes might be settled through negotiation, or they might require intervention from higher authorities, the local lord or bishop. The monastery also employs people directly. Lay brothers, as we've mentioned, are men who live according to a simplified version of the monastic rule and do much of the manual labor. Servants are hired from local villages for various tasks. Day laborers are employed during busy seasons like harvest. All of these people depend on the monastery for their livelihood. In this sense, the monastery functions as an economic engine for the region. It provides employment. It purchases goods from local craftsmen and farmers. It distributes alms to the poor. Money and goods circulate through the monastery and out into the local economy. The monastery also provides social services that we might today associate with government. There's charity, of course. The monastery distributes food to the hungry, particularly during times of famine. The rule specifies that a portion of the monastery's resources should be set aside for this purpose. There's health care. The monastery infirmary treats not just sick monks, but sometimes poor people from surrounding areas who have nowhere else to go. The infirmarian might have some medical knowledge, herbal remedies, basic surgical skills. It's not sophisticated medicine by modern standards, but it's better than nothing, and for many people it's the only medical care available. There's education. The monastery school teaches boys, preparing them either for monastic life or for positions in the church or in noble households. The education is primarily religious, Latin, scripture, the liturgy, but it also includes practical skills like reading and writing, arithmetic, perhaps some classical literature. For many boys, especially those from non-noble families, this education is life-changing. It provides opportunities that would otherwise be completely unavailable. A bright peasant boy who goes through the monastery school might become a priest, or a scribe, or an administrator. He escapes the hard physical labor and limited prospects of agricultural life. The monastery is also involved in legal matters. The abbot often serves as a judge in disputes involving monastery tenants or lands. He holds court, hears cases, renders judgments. This is partially a practical necessity. Someone needs to settle disputes and maintain order, but it's also a source of power and authority. Some abbots have considerable political power. A large, wealthy monastery with extensive lands is a significant force in regional politics. The abbot might be consulted by local nobles or even by the king. He might be called upon to mediate disputes between nobles. He might serve as an advisor, his wisdom and neutrality making him valuable in complex political situations. This political involvement can be tricky. The abbot is supposed to be focused on spiritual matters, on leading his community in prayer and virtue. But he's also responsible for protecting the monastery's interests, for ensuring the community has the resources it needs. Sometimes these roles conflict. An abbot might spend weeks or months away from the monastery, traveling to the royal court or to church councils, dealing with legal disputes over land, managing political alliances. While he's gone, the community functions under the prior, the second in command, but they miss their spiritual father. The abbot himself might feel torn between his duties to the monastery and his engagement with the world. The monastery also plays a role in preserving and transmitting knowledge, as we discussed in the chapter on the scriptorium. But this has wider implications beyond just copying manuscripts. When a monastery builds a library, collects books, it becomes a resource for the region. Scholars might come to study, to consult rare texts, Students might come to learn from the learned monks. The monastery becomes a center of intellectual life. Some monasteries develop reputations for particular expertise. One might be known for its collection of medical texts and its skilled infirmarian. Another might be renowned for its music, its beautiful liturgical chants. Another might be famous for a particular scholar monk who's made important contributions to theology or philosophy. This attracts visitors, students, people seeking knowledge, and this creates a kind of network. Monasteries are connected to each other through shared texts, through monks who travel from one house to another, through correspondence between abbots and scholars. A monk from a monastery in Ireland might travel to Italy to study under a renowned teacher. He brings back knowledge, texts, ideas. These spread through his monastery and from there to other monasteries in the region. Knowledge circulates, slowly but steadily through these monastic networks. The monastery also contributes to the broader church. Many bishops are drawn from the ranks of monks. A monk who's shown himself to be wise, learned, and holy might be appointed bishop of a diocese. This is often not what the monk wants. He chose monastic life, partially to escape the world, and now he's being thrust back into it in a position of high responsibility. But the church needs good bishops, and monasteries are obvious places to find them. So monks are sometimes drafted, so to speak, into higher positions. They leave the cloister and take up the crozier, the bishop's staff, and they try to apply monastic virtues to episcopal duties. Some monks also serve as missionaries. When Christianity spreads to new regions, monks are often the ones who do the work of conversion and church planting. Irish monks, particularly, were famous for their missionary zeal. They traveled throughout Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries, founding monasteries, preaching, converting pagans. Saint Columba went from Ireland to Scotland, founding the monastery at Iona. Saint Columbanus traveled to France, Switzerland, and Italy, establishing monasteries along the way. These missionary monks brought not just Christianity, but also literacy, agriculture techniques, and various aspects of Christian culture. The monasteries they founded became centers of Christian life in previously pagan regions. They evangelized, they taught, they modeled a different way of living. Over time, these mission monasteries had profound effects on the regions where they were established. There's also the monastery's role in politics, which we've touched on but which deserves more attention. In the early medieval period, the boundaries between church and state are blurred. Kings and nobles are deeply involved in church affairs, and churchmen are deeply involved in politics. A king might find a monastery partially out of genuine piety, but also as a way of extending his influence into a region. The monastery serves as an outpost of royal authority. The abbot is loyal to the king who founded the monastery, and he promotes the king's interests. Or a noble might place his younger son in a monastery, not primarily for the son's spiritual benefit, but to secure a position of influence. If the son becomes abbot, the family has a representative in a powerful institution. These political entanglements can corrupt monastic life. Abbots chosen for political reasons, rather than spiritual qualifications, might not lead their communities well. Monasteries might become wealthy and worldly, more focused on maintaining their economic and political position than on prayer and holiness. Reform movements periodically arise in response to these problems. Reformers call for a return to stricter observance of the rule, for less involvement in worldly affairs, for greater poverty and simplicity. The Cluniac reform in the 10th century, for example, pushed for monasteries to be independent of local nobles, subject only to the Pope, and to focus more purely on liturgical prayer. These tensions between the monastery's spiritual mission and its worldly entanglements are ongoing. They never fully resolve. The monastery needs resources from the world to survive, but accepting those resources creates obligations and complications. The monastery wants to serve the world through hospitality, education, and charity. But service requires engagement, and engagement brings the world's problems inside the monastery walls. Let's also consider the monastery's relationship with time and history. The monastery sees itself as part of a long tradition stretching back to the Desert Fathers, to the early church, to Christ himself. It's oriented toward eternity, toward heavenly realities that transcend temporal concerns. But the monastery also exists in specific historical moments, shaped by the politics, economics, and culture of its time. A monastery founded in 600 CE experiences the collapse of Roman order, the invasion of barbarian tribes, the transformation of the landscape. A monastery existing in 800 CE experiences the Carolingian Renaissance, the revival of learning under Charlemagne, new opportunities and new demands. The monks themselves might not think much about these historical forces. They're focused on their daily routine, their prayer and work. But historians looking back can see how monasteries both shape and are shaped by their times. During the chaos following Rome's fall, monasteries preserved literacy and learning. They maintained order in a disordered world. They were stable institutions in a time of instability. This wasn't their primary intention. They weren't thinking, we must preserve civilization for future generations. They were just trying to live faithfully, to pray the offices, to copy the scriptures. But the cumulative effect of their work was civilization preserved. Later, as more stable kingdoms emerged, monasteries played different roles. They became educational institutions, training clergy and administrators. They became economic powerhouses, developing agriculture and crafts. They became cultural centers, producing art and music and literature. The monastery's relationship with violence is worth examining too. The monastic vow of non-violence. The commitment to peace is clear. Monks don't bear arms. They don't participate in warfare. This is part of their separation from the world. But monasteries exist in a violent world. They can be targets. Raiders, Vikings particularly, attack monasteries because that's where valuable objects are kept. Precious manuscripts, liturgical vessels made of silver or gold, reliquaries containing saints' bones. These are valuable plunder. When raiders come, monks are largely defenseless. Some flee, taking the most precious items with them. Some stay and are killed or taken captive. Some monasteries are destroyed, burned to the ground, their communities scattered. The monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of England was sacked by Vikings in 7th. This raid is often cited as the beginning of the Viking Age. The monks were killed or enslaved. The treasures were looted. The beautiful manuscripts, the ones we value so highly today, were destroyed or carried off. Such events are traumatic, not just for the individual monks who suffer, but for the whole idea of what a monastery represents. A place of peace violated by violence, a sanctuary desecrated, a community dedicated to prayer murdered by pagans. Some monasteries developed defenses. They built thicker walls, sometimes walls that could genuinely resist attack. They build towers where monks can take refuge during raids. They make arrangements with local nobles for protection, though this creates obligation. The tension here is profound. The monastery is supposed to trust in God's protection, to renounce violence, to turn the other cheek. But when actual violence threatens, when your brothers are in danger, what do? Pure pacifism might mean death and destruction. Practical defense might mean compromising your principles. Different monasteries and different monks resolve this tension differently. Some remain committed to nonviolence and accept martyrdom if it comes. Some take pragmatic measures for self-defense while trying to minimize their participation in violence. There are no easy answers. The monastery also has a complex relationship with wealth. The ideal is poverty, the monk renouncing personal possessions, living simply. But the monastery as an institution often becomes wealthy. Land is donated, and land produces income. Books and liturgical items are given as gifts. Over time, the monastery accumulates resources. This wealth is supposed to be used for the glory of God and for serving others. Beautiful churches, fine liturgical vessels, well-made books. These honor God, hospitality, charity, education. These serve the community. But wealth can also corrupt. It can make the monks comfortable, complacent. It can attract the wrong sort of people, those seeking security rather than holiness. Reformers often target monastic wealth. They argue for stricter poverty, for simpler churches, for giving away excess resources. But even reforming communities, if they're successful, tend to attract donations and grow wealthy again over time. It's a cycle that repeats throughout medieval history. The monastery's relationship with women is another complex area. Monasteries are male communities, of course. Women who feel called to religious life join convents. Female monasteries that follow similar rules. Monks and nuns are supposed to have minimal contact. The separation of the sexes is strictly maintained in medieval Christianity. But in practice, there are interactions. Monasteries and convents might have administrative relationships. An abbot might serve as advisor to an abbess. A monastery might have economic obligations to a convent or vice versa. Women can be patrons of monasteries, donating land or money. Noble women sometimes found monasteries or support them financially. They correspond with abbots, discuss spiritual matters, sometimes form deep spiritual friendships conducted entirely through letters. Some famous examples: Saint Jerome had close relationships with wealthy Roman women who supported his work. Saint Anselm corresponded with various noble women, offering spiritual guidance. These relationships could be profound and spiritually fruitful, but they had to be carefully conducted to avoid scandal or temptation. The monastery also relates to the natural world in particular ways. The monastery is built in a landscape, and it transforms that landscape through its presence. Forests are cleared for fields. Rivers are diverted for mills. Gardens are planted. Orchards established. Monks develop detailed knowledge of their environment. They know the plants, which ones are edible or medicinal. They know the animals, the patterns of weather, the quirks of local geology. This knowledge is practical, necessary for survival, but it also has a contemplative dimension. Saint Benedict wrote that monks should see Christ in guests. But broader medieval theology suggests seeing God in all of creation. The natural world is God's creation, and it reflects His glory. The beauty of a sunset, the intricacy of a flower, the majesty of mountains, these point to their Creator. So the monk working in the garden isn't just producing food. He's also contemplating creation, seeing God's work, participating in the ongoing creative activity of God who sustains all things in being. This contemplative relationship with nature is part of what makes monastic agriculture potentially more sustainable than purely exploitative approaches. The monk isn't just trying to extract maximum yield. He's trying to work in harmony with the land, to be a steward rather than a tyrant. Of course, this ideal isn't always realized. Monks are human and can be as short-sighted as anyone. But at its best, monastic agriculture has a wisdom and sustainability that comes from long-term commitment to place and from a theological framework that values creation. As a monk grows old in the monastery, his relationship with the wider world often diminishes. He's less likely to be assigned tasks that involve travel or contact with outsiders. He becomes more fully embedded in the monastery community, his world narrowing to these walls, these brothers, these familiar routines. But even in old age, the connection remains. The world he withdrew from decades ago is still there, beyond the walls. And the world continues to be shaped, in small but real ways, by the prayers he offers, the wisdom he's accumulated, the example of his faithful life. When he dies and is buried in the monastery cemetery, his body returns to the earth of this place that has been his home. And the monastery continues, connected to the world in all these complex ways, separate but not isolated, withdrawn but not absent, a peculiar presence that serves purposes both obvious and hidden. Let's step back now and take a wider view. We've walked through the daily life of a monk, explored the monastery's buildings and routines, examined the inner spiritual life and the outer connections to the world. Now let's think about what all of this meant, what it accomplished over the long span of centuries. Because the monastery wasn't just about the individual monks living their individual lives, it was part of something larger, a movement that shaped Western civilization in a profound way. And the monks themselves, focused on their daily prayers and work, probably didn't realize the scope of what they were collectively achieving. Let's start with the most obvious contribution, the preservation of knowledge. When the Western Roman Empire fell, and historians debate the exact dates, but most point to somewhere in the late 5th century, the infrastructure that had supported learning largely collapsed. The urban centers that had housed libraries and schools declined or disappeared. The wealthy families that had supported scholars and teachers lost their wealth or their interest. The roads that had connected the empire and allowed for the circulation of books and ideas became dangerous and less traveled. Literacy declined sharply. In the year 400 CE, a significant portion of the urban population could read, at least at a basic level. By 600 CE, literacy was rare, confined mostly to clergy and a few nobles. The written word, which had been common, became precious and unusual. In this context, the monasteries became refuges for books and learning. They weren't the only places where knowledge survived. Some cathedral schools, some noble courts, maintained some learning, but the monasteries were the most consistent, the most committed, the most numerous. Think about what would have been lost without them. The works of Virgil and Ovid, Cicero and Seneca, Tacitus and Livy. These classical authors survived the medieval period almost entirely through copies made in monastery scriptoria. In many cases, every surviving ancient manuscript traces back to a single medieval copy made by monks. If that one monastery had not copied that one text, it would be lost forever. And it's not just that the texts physically survived. The monks read them, studied them, thought about them. They wrote commentaries and annotations. They transmitted classical learning to new generations. When learning revived in later centuries, when universities were founded and scholarship flourished again, the raw materials for that revival came from monastery libraries. But the monks didn't just preserve classical knowledge. They also developed new knowledge, made original contributions to human learning. Take agriculture. Monasteries were substantial agricultural operations, and monks experimented with techniques, developed innovations. They bred better strains of crops and livestock. They improved methods of cultivation and irrigation. They wrote treatises on agriculture, compiling best practices, the knowledge of how to manage forests sustainably, how to rotate crops, how to build efficient mills, how to maintain soil fertility. Much of this was developed or preserved in monasteries and then spread to surrounding communities. Or consider architecture. Monasteries were building constantly, churches and dormitories and workshops. They developed construction techniques, figured out how to create strong vaults and arches, how to direct water for sanitation and power. The Romanesque architecture that characterized the period, with its rounded arches and massive walls, was largely developed through church and monastery construction. Later, as Gothic architecture emerged, monasteries were again at the forefront. The great Gothic cathedrals get most of the attention, but many of the techniques were first worked out in monastery churches. The pointed arch, the flying buttress, the emphasis on light through large windows. These innovations had theological motivations. They were trying to create spaces that lifted the soul toward God, but they also represented genuine engineering advances. Music is another area of monastic contribution. The development of musical notation, The ability to write down a melody so it could be accurately reproduced happened in monasteries. Before notation, music was taught by rote, passed from teacher to student. This limited what could be preserved and shared. Monks working on liturgical music needed a way to record the chants so they could be sung the same way in different monasteries. Various systems of notation were tried. Eventually, a workable system emerged, using a staff with lines and notes placed on or between the lines to indicate pitch. This seems simple to us now, but it was revolutionary. It allowed music to spread rapidly. A chant composed in one monastery could be written down and sent to another monastery, hundreds of miles away, and it could be sung there just as the composer intended. This accelerated musical development enormously. Guido of Arezzo, a monk in the early 11th century, made crucial contributions to musical notation. He developed a system of psalmization using syllables, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, to teach pitch. He refined the staff system. His innovations became standard throughout Europe. The result was a flowering of sacred music, increasingly complex and beautiful polyphony developing over the following centuries. And it all traced back to monks trying to sing the liturgy more beautifully and consistently. Medicine was another field where monasteries made contributions. The infirmary in every monastery was a place where practical medical knowledge was developed and applied. Monks compiled herbals, books describing medicinal plants and their uses. They experimented with remedies, kept records of what worked and what didn't. Some of this knowledge came from classical sources, Greek and Roman medical texts that the monks copied and studied, but much came from trial and error, from monks observing the effects of various treatments and learning from experience. The monastery garden included a section for medicinal herbs, and the infirmarian needed to know which plants treated which ailments. Feverfew for headaches, chamomile for digestive issues, willow bark for pain, though they didn't know it contained the compound that would eventually become aspirin. St. John's wort for melancholy, yarrow to stop bleeding. This knowledge was shared between monasteries through books and through traveling monks. It also spread to the surrounding population. Local people might come to the monastery infirmary for treatment, and they would see which remedies were used. They might grow some of these plants in their own gardens. Monasteries also made contributions to timekeeping and calendar making. The need to observe the hours of prayer precisely meant monks needed accurate ways to measure time. They used various methods: water clocks, candle clocks, sundials. They observed the stars and planets, learning to track time by celestial movement. The liturgical calendar was complex, with movable feasts, like Easter, that required calculation. Monks became expert at computes, the calculation of the date of Easter, and other movable feasts. This required mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Bede, the English monk we mentioned earlier, wrote treatises on computes that became standard references. He also proposed a new way of numbering years, using the Anno Domini system, years counted from the birth of Christ. This system eventually became standard throughout the Christian world, and eventually globally. So when you use the current year system, you're using something that was popularized by a monk working in a monastery in Northumbria in the early 8th century. The Carolingian Renaissance deserves special attention because it demonstrates so clearly the role of monasteries in cultural transmission and development. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800 CE, wanted to reform and educate his realm. He recognized that his kingdom lacked sufficient educated administrators, that clergy were often barely literate, that learning had declined to a dangerous degree. He turned to the church and specifically to monasteries for help. He recruited scholars, many of them monks, from throughout Europe. Alcuin of York, a monk and scholar from England, became his chief educational advisor. Together, they established palace schools and cathedral schools. They reformed monastic education, setting higher standards. They sponsored the copying of manuscripts on an unprecedented scale. Scriptoria throughout the empire worked to produce copies of religious and classical texts. They also reformed handwriting. The various scripts used in different regions were often difficult to read, inconsistent. Alcuin and his colleagues developed Caroline Minuscule, the clear, readable script we discussed in the Scriptorium chapter. This became the standard script throughout the Carolingian Empire and beyond. The effect was a genuine renaissance, a rebirth of learning. Literacy increased. More books were produced. Schools were established. A generation of educated clergy emerged who could teach the next generation. This wouldn't have been possible without the monasteries. They provided the infrastructure, the scriptoria, the libraries, the trained scribes. They provided many of the teachers, and they provided a model of how learning could be pursued within a Christian framework. The Carolingian Renaissance eventually faded. The empire fragmented, and Europe entered another period of instability. But the knowledge preserved, and the standards established continued. The manuscripts copied during this period survived and continued to be copied. The educational institutions, though they struggled at times, persisted. Let's think about literacy more broadly. In the early medieval period, to be literate meant, essentially, to know Latin, the vernacular languages, the various forms of early French, German, English, Italian. These were spoken languages but rarely written. Latin was the language of the church, of learning, of administration. If you wanted to read any book, conduct any official business, participate in intellectual life, you needed Latin. And where did you learn Latin? In church schools, many of them monastic. The monks were, in effect, the keepers of a linguistic tradition. Latin could have died out, could have fragmented into the vernacular languages and disappeared as a unified tongue. But because the church continued to use Latin, because monks continued to read and write Latin, because education continued to be conducted in Latin, the language survived. This had enormous implications. It meant that a scholar in Ireland could read a book written by a scholar in Italy. It meant there was a common language for intellectual discourse. Across the enormous diversity of medieval Europe, it created a kind of unity, a shared culture, despite political fragmentation. Over time, as vernacular languages developed, written forms in vernacular literature emerged. This would change. But for centuries, Latin was the language of learning, and monks were central to maintaining it. The monastery also provided a model of community that was influential. The idea that people could live together, share resources, work cooperatively for common goals, submit to a rule that governed all equally. This was unusual in the hierarchical, often violent world of the early Middle Ages. The monastery demonstrated that another way of living was possible. Not perfect. Monasteries had their conflicts and failures, but relatively peaceful, relatively just, relatively ordered. For people living in societies where violence and exploitation were common, where the strong preyed on the weak, the monastery offered a vision of something different. This vision influenced how Christians thought about what society should be like. The idea of a rule of law, that even the powerful should be bound by rules. The idea of mutual obligation, that we have responsibilities to each other. The idea of service, that leadership means serving rather than dominating. These ideas, lived out imperfectly but genuinely in monasteries, gradually influenced broader society. Monasteries also preserved and transmitted Christian theology and spirituality. The writings of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory, Ambrose, these were copied and studied in monasteries. The great theological debates of the early church were preserved in books that monks copied. Monks also made original contributions to theology and spirituality. They wrote commentaries on scripture, developing deeper understandings of biblical texts. They wrote works on prayer and the spiritual life, drawing on their own experience to guide others. The mystical tradition in Christianity, the writings of those who experienced deep union with God, was largely preserved and developed in monasteries. Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, Bernard of Clairvaux, Meister Eckhart, these and many others were monastics or had close connections to monastic communities. Their writings on the interior life, on the experience of God's presence, on the journey of the soul toward God. These have shaped Christian spirituality for centuries. They continue to be read and valued today, offering wisdom that transcends their original historical context. The visual arts also flourished in monasteries. Illuminated manuscripts, as we discussed, were works of art, but monasteries also produced metalwork, carved ivories, embroidered vestments, all manner of liturgical objects that were both functional and beautiful. The idea that art should glorify God, that beauty itself is a kind of offering, was deeply embedded in monastic culture. The finest materials, the most skilled craftsmanship. These weren't seen as wasteful, but as appropriate for worshiping the creator of all beauty. This commitment to beauty in liturgical art would influence European art for centuries. The aesthetic sensibilities developed in monastery workshops, the standards of craftsmanship, the iconographic traditions, these spread throughout Christian Europe. Let's think about the long-term economic impact of monasteries. As we discussed, monasteries were often large landowners, and they managed their lands more systematically than many secular lords. Monasteries kept records. They planned for the long term because they expected to exist in perpetuity. They invested in infrastructure, building mills and improving roads and clearing forests for cultivation. They introduced crops and agricultural techniques from other regions. The Cistercian order, which emerged in the late 11th century as a reform movement emphasizing austerity and manual labor, was particularly important economically. Cistercian monasteries were often founded in remote, undeveloped areas. The monks and lay brothers cleared land, drained swamps, built dams and irrigation systems. Within a generation or two, these previously marginal lands became productive farms. The Cistercians became famous for their wool production, raising large flocks of sheep on lands that weren't suitable for grain cultivation. They developed a reputation for quality, and Cistercian wool became a valuable trade commodity. More broadly, monasteries provided economic stability. They were institutions that persisted across generations. A secular lord might die. His lands might be divided among heirs or seized by enemies. But a monastery continued, and this continuity provided a foundation for economic development. Monasteries also drove technological development in various ways. The need for parchment drove improvements in parchment making. The need for better light in scriptoria led to developments in candle making and in window glass. The need to feed large communities led to improvements in milling and baking. Water power was harnessed extensively by monasteries. Water mills for grinding grain, for fulling cloth, for powering various industrial processes. The technology wasn't invented by monks, but they adopted it widely and improved it. The Cistercians, again, were leaders here. A typical Cistercian monastery might have multiple water-powered mills for different purposes. The same stream might be dammed to create a series of mill ponds, each powering a different operation. The engineering required for this was sophisticated, and the knowledge spread from monastery to monastery. Now let's think about something harder to quantify, but perhaps even more important: the spiritual and psychological impact of monasteries on medieval people. For most people in the early Middle Ages, life was hard and short. Infant mortality was high. Disease was common. Famine occurred regularly. War was frequent. The average person lived with constant anxiety about survival, about having enough food, about protecting their family from violence. In this context, the monastery represented something different. It was a place of order and peace. When you heard the bells ringing, calling the monks to prayer, you were reminded that someone was praying. That even in a chaotic world, someone was maintaining the rhythm of worship. That God was being honored, continually, day and night. This was psychologically important. It provided a sense that the world had meaning, had structure, that chaos wasn't the final word. The monastery, visible on its hill or in its valley, was a physical reminder of this. For many people, the monastery was also a place of hope. If life became unbearable, if you lost your family to plague, if you couldn't find work, you could perhaps go to the monastery. You could become a lay brother, or you could simply show up at the gate asking for alms. The monastery wouldn't solve all your problems, but it offered something, a lifeline in desperate times, and the knowledge that prayers were being offered for you and your loved ones. This too was comforting. When someone died, when there was sickness or trouble, you could ask the monastery to pray. You could even, if you had resources, donate something to the monastery and request prayers in perpetuity. This sense of being held in prayer, of being part of a community that extended beyond your immediate family and village, this was valuable. The monastery also provided a sense of connection to something larger than the present moment. When you visited a monastery church, you saw memorials to people who had died decades or centuries ago. You were reminded that you were part of a long story, that your life connected to the past and would extend into the future. The very permanence of the monastery, the stone buildings that had stood for generations and would stand for generations more, this was reassuring in a world where so much was temporary and precarious. Let's also consider the negative aspects and limitations, because a full picture requires. Monasteries were not perfect institutions. They could be corrupt. Abbots could be worldly, more interested in power and wealth than in holiness. Monks could be lazy, going through the motions without real devotion. The gap between the ideal of poverty and the reality of wealthy monasteries with extensive lands could be scandalous. Some monasteries exploited their tenants, demanding excessive rents and labor. Some became entangled in secular politics in ways that compromised their spiritual mission. Some were more concerned with maintaining their privileges and property than with serving God or neighbor. Reform movements repeatedly emerged because people recognized that monasteries had drifted from their ideal. The Cluniac reforms, the Cistercian movement, later the Franciscans and Dominicans, with their emphasis on poverty and preaching. All of these arose partially in response to perceived monastic decadence. There's also a question about what was lost when so many talented, intelligent people withdrew into monasteries. Men who might have been leaders in their communities, who might have married and had children, who might have contributed in other ways, instead devoted their lives to the cloister. From a purely demographic standpoint, this represented a loss. And from a social standpoint, it could be problematic. Some monasteries became quite wealthy while many laypeople were desperately poor. The contrast could breed resentment. There's also the question of whether the monastic emphasis on withdrawing from the world, on renouncing marriage and family, on seeing the body and its desires as dangerous, whether this created unhealthy attitudes that damaged individuals and society. These are complex questions without simple answers. The monastic movement had costs as well as benefits, created problems as well as solving them. Any fair assessment must acknowledge both. But stepping back and looking at the overall arc of history, the net effect seems positive. The monks of the early medieval period preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. They maintained literacy when it was in danger of disappearing. They developed technologies and techniques that improved life for many people. They created islands of peace and order in a turbulent world. They demonstrated that life could be lived according to principles other than violence and exploitation. And perhaps most importantly, they maintained a space for the contemplative life, for the pursuit of God, for the belief that spiritual realities matter, and that time spent in prayer is time well spent. This is countercultural in any age, but it was especially important in that era. It would have been easy for Christianity to become entirely worldly, entirely concerned with power and politics, entirely absorbed into the violent warrior culture of the period. The monasteries insisted that there was another way, that contemplation mattered, that gentleness and humility were virtues, that the soul's needs were at least as important as the body's needs. When we look at illuminated manuscripts today, at the Book of Kells or the Lindisfarne Gospels, we're looking at objects created by men who devoted years of their lives to making something beautiful for God. The incredible intricacy of the decoration, the vibrant colors that still gleam after more than 1,000 years, the sense that every millimeter of the page received careful attention. This speaks to a kind of devotion that's hard for us to fully grasp. These monks weren't making art for museums or for fame. Most of them are anonymous. We don't know their names. They were making art as an offering, as prayer, as a way of honoring the sacred texts they were copying. And those books, along with thousands of less ornate but equally important manuscripts, preserved the texts that formed the foundation of Western culture. The Bible, obviously, but also classical literature, theology, history, science, all of it copied patiently by monks who understood they were doing something important, even if they couldn't have articulated exactly what. There's a story, probably apocryphal but symbolically true, about a young monk who asks his abbot, "What good does it do to copy all these books? Who will read them?" And the abbot responds, "We don't know, but someone will need them someday, and they won't be there if we don't copy them now." That faith, that willingness to do important work without seeing the results, that patience across generations, this is part of what the monastic movement represented. As we come to the end of this long exploration, it's worth reflecting on what we can learn from these monks of the Dark Ages. Most of us won't become monks, won't withdraw from the world to live in community under a strict rule. But there are principles and practices from monastic life that might still have value. The importance of routine and rhythm. The monks structured their days with prayer and work, and this structure provided stability and meaning. In our fragmented, chaotic modern lives, we might benefit from more intentional structure, from regular practices that ground us, the balance of contemplation and action. The monks prayed and they worked, and each enriched the other. We tend to be all action, constantly busy, without time for reflection, or we're so focused on inner development that we neglect service to others. The monastic balance suggests both are necessary. The commitment to community. The monks lived together, worked through their conflicts, supported each other through difficulty. They recognized that spiritual growth happens in relationship, not just in isolation. We too need community, need people who know us deeply and hold us accountable and celebrate our growth. The appreciation for beauty in the midst of simplicity. The monks lived simply, but they created and surrounded themselves with beauty, especially in liturgy and art. This suggests that beauty isn't a luxury, but a necessity, something that feeds the soul. The long view, the willingness to invest in things that won't pay off in your lifetime. The monks planted trees they'd never see fully grown. They started projects that would take generations to complete. They thought in terms of centuries, not quarters. We're often so focused on immediate results that we neglect work that matters, but takes time. And perhaps most importantly, the belief that some things are worth doing for their own sake, not for any practical benefit. Prayer, beauty, contemplation, these don't produce measurable outcomes. They don't contribute to GDP, but they're essential to human flourishing, to a life that's about more than mere survival or success. The monks of the Dark Ages, living in their monasteries, following their rule, singing their psalms, copying their manuscripts, they remind us that there are different ways to live, different values to pursue. They point us toward the possibility of a life oriented around something transcendent, something eternal, something that gives meaning to the daily struggle. And for that, perhaps more than for all their practical contributions, we should be grateful. And so we come to the end of our time together tonight. We've spent these hours walking through the life of a monk in the Dark Ages, We've explored the monastery's buildings, stone by stone. We've followed the daily rhythm of prayer, from vigils in the deep night to compline as darkness falls. We've sat in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts letter by letter. We've worked in the gardens and fields, feeling the earth under our hands. We've explored the inner life, the struggles and consolations of the spiritual path. We've examined how the monastery connected to the wider world, and we've taken the long view, seeing how all of this shaped Western civilization. It's been a journey, hasn't it? A slow journey, as all the best journeys are. The life of a monk in this period was not easy. It required sacrifice. You gave up family, gave up the possibility of romantic love and children. You gave up personal possessions, personal autonomy, the freedom to make your own choices about how to spend your time. You committed to a place and a community for life, accepting that this was your world, these walls, these brothers, this routine, until death. The work was often tedious, copying the same psalms you'd sung 10,000 times before, weeding the same garden beds, year after year, rising at 2 in the morning, in the cold and dark, because that's when vigils was scheduled. The monotony could be crushing at times. And yet, within this structure, within this repetition, something remarkable happened. Lives were transformed. Men who came to the monastery selfish and proud, over decades became humble and generous. Men who came angry and violent became peaceful. Not perfectly, not completely, but really, the change was real. And beyond the individual transformations, there was the collective work. The manuscripts copied, now housed in libraries around the world, still readable, still valuable. The agricultural knowledge developed, which improved farming practices for centuries. The architecture created, churches that still stand, still inspire awe. The music composed, chants that are still sung. The model of community demonstrated, showing that people can live together in relative peace and mutual support. All of this came from men living quiet lives, mostly anonymous, following a rule, doing their daily work. They weren't trying to save civilization. They were trying to follow Christ, to become holy, to praise. But in doing so and being faithful to their particular calling, they accomplished something larger than themselves. There's a lesson in that, I think. We often feel that we need to do something grand to make a difference. We need to change the world, leave our mark, accomplish great things. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes great things need to be done. But more often, what's needed is faithfulness in small things, showing up every day, doing the work that's in front of you, even when it's tedious, being kind to the people around you, even when they're difficult, maintaining your practices, your prayers or meditations or whatever grounds you, even when they feel dry and pointless. The monks didn't know their copied manuscripts would preserve Western learning. They were just doing their job, copying the books that needed to be copied. They didn't know their agricultural innovations would spread and improve farming throughout Europe. They were just trying to feed their community. They didn't know their daily prayers, and their example of peaceful living would influence how Christians thought about life and community for centuries. They were just trying to follow their rule and grow in holiness, faithfulness, patience, the willingness to do work that matters without seeing the results. These are monastic virtues, and they might be exactly what our frantic instant results modern world needs. As I sit here now, finishing my tea, thinking about these monks, I'm struck by how different their world was from ours. No electricity, no technology beyond the simplest tools, no instant communication, no global travel. Their world was small, bounded by the monastery walls and the fields surrounding it. They went weeks or months without seeing anyone from outside their immediate community. And yet, in fundamental ways, they were just like us. They struggled with the same temptations: pride, anger, lust, envy. They experienced the same longings for meaning, for connection, For peace, they ask the same questions. Why am I here? What should I do with my life? Is there something more than just surviving day to day? Their answers, the monastic answers, won't be everyone's answers. Most of us aren't called to withdraw from the world, to take vows of poverty and chastity and obedience. We have families to care for, work to do in the world, responsibilities that tie us to secular life. But even so, there's something in the monastic way that speaks to something deep in the human soul. The hunger for structure, for rhythm, for practices that connect us to something larger than ourselves. The recognition that we need both action and contemplation, both community and solitude. The understanding that becoming fully human, becoming who we're meant to be, requires discipline and practice and time. The monasteries of the Dark Ages are mostly gone now, at least in their original form. Some were destroyed by Vikings or other raiders. Some declined and were abandoned. Some were dissolved during the Protestant Reformation. Some persisted but changed, evolved, adapted to new times, but their influence remains. In the manuscripts preserved in libraries, in the traditions of scholarship and education, in the architectural heritage of Europe, in the musical traditions of sacred chant, in the spiritual writings that still guide seekers today, in the very structure of time, the calendar we use, the hours we count, and perhaps most importantly, in the idea that contemplation matters, that prayer is worth doing, that withdrawing from the noise and busyness to seek silence and depth is not escapism, but one of the most human and necessary things we can do. As you drift off to sleep tonight, if you're ready for sleep, or as you continue with your evening if you're not, perhaps you might hold in your mind an image of a monastery, the stone walls, solid and enduring, the cloister garden, peaceful in the evening light, the church, with candles flickering before the altar, the bells ringing across the valley, calling the monks to pray. Perhaps you might imagine yourself there for a moment, not as a monk necessarily, but as a visitor, a guest being welcomed as Christ. You're tired from your journey, whatever journey you've been on. You're given water to wash, food to eat, a place to rest. You're safe here, at least for tonight, and in the church you can hear the monks singing. You can't see them, they're in the choir behind a screen, but you can hear their voices, chanting in Latin, words you don't understand but which carry a weight of meaning and tradition. The sound is beautiful, otherworldly, and for a moment the concerns you've been carrying seem to lift. For a moment there's just this, the sound of voices raised in praise, the flicker of candlelight, the cool stone beneath your feet, the sense of being held in something larger than yourself. And that's enough. For now, that's enough. The monks continue their singing. They'll sing Compline soon, the completion of the day. They'll observe the great silence. They'll go to their beds in the dormitory. And they'll sleep for a few hours before rising again for vigil. Tomorrow, they'll do it all again. The same prayers, the same work, the same rhythms. And the day after that, and the day after that. For years, for decades, for lifetimes. There's something both sobering and comforting about that. The sameness, the repetition, could feel like imprisonment, or it could feel like freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing exactly what's expected, from having a clear path, from being part of something that's been going on for centuries and will continue after you're gone. Perhaps we need both in our lives. The freedom to choose, to change, to try new things, and also the stability of routine, of practices that ground us, of commitments that persist through changing circumstances. The monk made his choice. He chose stability, chose one place and one community for life. He chose the routine, chose to embrace the repetition rather than fleeing from it. And within that choice, within those constraints, he found a particular kind of freedom and meaning. Most of us will make different choices, but we can still learn from his example. We can still appreciate what he and his brothers accomplished. We can still be grateful that when civilization seemed on the verge of collapse, When knowledge seemed in danger of being lost, when violence and chaos threatened to overwhelm everything, there were these communities of men in their monasteries, quietly preserving what mattered, copying manuscripts by candlelight, singing psalms in the pre-dawn darkness, tending gardens and caring for the sick and welcoming strangers, doing small things faithfully, patiently, without recognition or reward, and in doing so, keeping alive a tradition, a way of life, a set of values that would eventually help renew and rebuild a civilization. They couldn't have known what they were accomplishing. They just showed up, every day, and did the work. That's all any of us can do, really. Show up. Do the work. Be faithful in the small things. Trust that somehow, in ways we can't see or predict, it matters. The bells have stopped ringing now. The monastery settles into silence. The monks are in their beds. The candles in the church burn low. Outside, the stars wheel overhead, as they have for millennia, as they will for millennia to come. Tomorrow, the bells will ring again. Another day will begin. The cycle continues, reliable as the sunrise, steady as the tide. And there's profound peace in that. In a world that often feels uncertain and chaotic, there's comfort in knowing that somewhere, someone is keeping vigil, someone is maintaining the rhythm, someone is preserving what matters. We've reached the end of our journey tonight. Thank you for walking with me through these monastery walls, through these centuries. Thank you for your patience with this slow, contemplative exploration. I hope you found something valuable here, something that speaks to you, something you might carry with you. The monks would say, as they said at the end of every prayer, every office, "Thanks be to God." And so we say it too. Thanks be to God for these monks, for their faithfulness, for their legacy. Thanks be to God for the opportunity to learn about them, to remember them, to honor their lives. May you rest well tonight. May you find peace in your own rhythms and routine. May you discover, in your own way, the balance of prayer and work, of contemplation and action, of community and solitude, that makes a life meaningful and whole. The monastery bells are silent now. The monks are sleeping. The stars shine in the darkness above the stone walls, and all is well. Rest now, until next time.